We are pleased to have you join us today as we explore how to find common ground for prioritizing students' right to an education that prepares them to participate effectively in civic and political life. Your input is valuable, so please feel free to engage with one another and with the panelists in the chat box. There will be an opportunity for Q&A after each session, and if you have specific questions for the panelists or the moderator, please use the Q&A function where you have the option to submit questions anonymously. If you are directing your question to someone in particular, be sure to indicate that when you're sending it in. This conference will be recorded, so keep an eye out for an email with instructions on how to access the recordings. And finally, at the end of the conference, you'll have another opportunity to provide your input into the direction of this important endeavor through a survey that will pop up in your browser, and it will also be sent to your emails. Your participation will be greatly appreciated.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Rowley, and I'm the Provost, Dean, and Vice President for Academic Affairs of Teachers College. In our fractured national era, I'm especially heartened to welcome today's distinguished guests and panelists, as well as our faculty members, students, alumni, and audience, to Finding Common Ground on Civic Education in Turbulent Times, presented by TC's Center for Educational Equity. As the first and largest graduate school of education in the nation, Teachers College bears a special responsibility, not only to understand and account for how our society affects classrooms, but how education itself makes and remakes the values that we as a society hold dear. Ongoing inequities in access to education and the choice we've made as a nation to de-emphasize civic education over the past 50 years is reflected in the widespread lack of understanding about democratic norms and values across the political spectrum and feelings of disenfranchisement in so many communities. With decreasing understanding about democracy, the rancor that has infected national politics is now also showing itself in local school board meetings and town halls in every corner of the country. Today's event seeks to engage with these tangled political and pedagogical needs. How do we have meaningful conversations in light of political disagreement? And then, what do children need to learn in classrooms to participate in and strengthen our democratic society? With that, I would like to, once again, thank you all for joining us today and welcome Michael A. Rebell, Professor of Law and Educational Practice and Executive Director of the Center for Educational Equity, to give today's opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome. We appreciate all of you taking the time to join us in what we think is going to be a very stimulating and important discussion today. We have a very distinguished group of participants, panelists, and your participation as knowledgeable people, concerned people with these issues through the chat, through the questions you're going to ask, are going to be extremely important. Now, I'd like to begin the discussion by bringing to your attention a statement that was recently made by William Smith, who is a federal district judge in the federal court in the state of Rhode Island. And he delivered a extensive decision in the case of Cook v. McKee, in which 14 Rhode Island public school students are seeking to have the federal courts declare that they have a right under the US Constitution to an education that will prepare them adequately to be effective citizens. And after hearing their arguments and considering these issues in depth, in his 50-page decision, Judge Smith stated quite bluntly, American democracy is in peril. I think we all know that. Our democracy is in peril. And Judge Smith went on to say, quote, our country's survival and the students' ability to reap the benefit of living in a country with robust freedoms and rights, a strong economy, and a moral center protected by the rule of law is something that citizens must cherish, protect, and constantly work for. We would do well to pay attention to their plea. Judge Smith also noted that the first defense against the degeneration of a democracy is a, quote, thorough understanding of the institutions and practices of the democratic order and the government that it licenses. Now, as most of you know, historically, our public school system, originally known as the Common School Movement back in the 19th century, was founded precisely for this purpose, to prepare the citizens for this fledgling republic, this experiment in mass democracy that our founders had established 240 years ago. Horace Mann, who was the originator of the Common School Movement, put it quite directly. He said, quote, "Under our Republican form of government, it is clear that the minimum of education can never be less than is sufficient to qualify each citizen for the civil and social duties he will be called upon to discharge." Throughout most of American history, our schools have performed that function well. Their main emphasis was on preparing kids to be good citizens, to understand the history of the country, to understand the democratic values, to understand what it means to be a citizen. Unfortunately, I think it's fair to say, and Judge Smith was very definitely saying it, our schools today are not living up to this historic responsibility. And let me just quote a couple of statistics to bring that point home. On the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as NAEP, which is also known as the nation's report card, there is an assessment given every 4 years of the state of knowledge in social studies, in history, and also in civics. And over the last decade, the number of students that have ranked as being proficient in civics has remained at an incredibly low figure of 23 to 24%. So let me repeat that. Only 23 or 24% of our students are considered proficient in the knowledge that they need to be effective citizens in our country today. In my mind, a statistic that is perhaps even more concerning is the result of a world values survey that was done a few years ago. This was a survey done in the United States and several other countries. And what this survey was doing was trying to probe attitudes toward democracy. So one of the key questions was, is it absolutely essential to live in a democracy? Is it absolutely essential to live in a democracy? Of those people born before World War II, the oldest generation that was surveyed, 72% said, yes, it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. But when this question was asked of the millennial generation, those born after 1980, that percentage had shrunk to 30%. Only 30% of the millennials were willing to state that it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. That's one of the reasons why our Center for Educational Equity has decided to initiate a number of litigations to try to galvanize interest and more than interest, to galvanize movement toward making civic education a priority throughout the United States. And we were the lead counsel in that Cook v. McKee case that I mentioned earlier. We did convince Judge Smith of the great importance of this issue. And as I say, he read all the books and legal precedents we brought to his attention, wrote a 50-page decision that's impassioned. He's been out speaking about the importance of civic education, but he said, unfortunately, he doesn't think that federal law as it now exists allows him to issue an order that schools have to do more. Well, we're still in disagreement with Judge Smith about that, and we're currently petitioning the United States Supreme Court to ask him to look into the federal law. And we have a number of arguments why we do think that such a right does exist or should be declared to exist under the US Constitution. We'll have to see if the Supreme Court is willing to pick up this case. They take very few cases. We're aware of this, but the importance of these issues at this time is a factor that I think could make a difference. In any event, I also want to bring to your attention that at the state level, state highest courts, state Supreme Courts have been aware of this factor. And 32 out of the 50 highest courts among the states have specifically said that civic education is either the prime purpose of education, which it always was historically, or one of the prime purposes. And the other 18 have not denied that. They just haven't spoken to the issue. So state court litigation, state constitutions is another fertile field for those who want to pursue the legal route for trying to get an emphasis, get attention, motivate legislators, states, school districts to understand the importance of what really is a student's right and society's right to have civic education be where it should be in our current age. Our center also engages in advocacy work and policy work, in research in this area. We've put up our websites in the chat box. I know a number of other organizations. Civics Now is doing a great job on the national level in trying to move this along. And I know all of you who have tuned in for today's events have a great interest in this. But the reason that we're focusing in this particular webinar on this question of finding common ground is, as you all know, we live in a highly polarized environment. And, you know, some people have said to me, this is probably the worst time for you to be pushing for this question of prioritizing civic education, going to courts, talking about this. It's too difficult. We're too polarized. People are too far apart. Well, that's precisely why this is the best of all times, or it's certainly the most important of all times, that we've got to bring this to the fore. And as all of you know, we've had a trend in recent months for a number of states, state legislatures, to enact statutes that are constricting the ability of teachers to deal effectively with civic education. There have been statutes passed now in 11 states that specifically outlaw speaking about certain topics or constrain the teacher's ability to approach topics in certain ways. And there are bills pending in dozens more states. Sometimes the media has overplayed that. It isn't 30 states where they've passed these statutes. It's only 11 at this point, but 11 is a large number in our federal system. And the bigger point here is that the fact that this is going on and it's become part of the culture wars means that there's been a chilling effect on teachers, schools throughout the country, whether their state legislatures have specifically enacted these kinds of laws. It's making it much, much more difficult for teachers to feel free to discuss controversial issues, which is an essential aspect of teaching education and teaching civic education. So how do we move past these culture wars? How can we start bringing people together to look at what is the essence of civic education? How much do we all agree? I think most of us from all sides of the political spectrum are going to agree on the key elements that are needed. Our schools have to provide more civic knowledge, civic skills, civic experiences, civic values. We have to wrestle with what those values are. We have to articulate them. That's part of the challenge. It's also part of the beauty of dealing with civic issues in a vibrant democracy. And you know, the importance of this, of dealing with civic education in this polarized environment was really brought home by a recent survey that the Lutz organization undertook for Civics Now, where they asked the question, in our highly polarized society, what can help what can help us deal with this incredible polarization? What is the best thing that can be done? And among 7 options that the respondents had, the number one by both Republicans and Democrats was we need more civic education. So that's the purpose that we're pushing here. And we're going to begin today's event with a discussion by two really well-known scholars, researchers, policy advocates for civic education, one of whose picture just flashed before us. It was Pedro Noguera, who's the Dean of the Education School at the University of Southern California. And Pedro has, over the last couple of years, been discussing these issues about common values with Rick Hess from the American Enterprise Institute. And although they are generally seen as people who come to these issues from different places on the political spectrum, they have done a tremendous job in talking through how they are finding common ground in these difficult times, and working toward emphasizing what we all have in common with civic education. So we're going to begin our discussion with a conversation between Rick and Pedro, and help them have them illustrate to you where people from different sides of the political spectrum can find common ground, and where they don't find common ground, where they can have respectful disagreements. After that, we will have a very engaging panel with four outstanding thinkers in this field, thinkers and activists, being led by Peter Levine, the Dean of School of Civic Studies at Tufts University. I'll introduce him more formally in a moment. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be in for a really stimulating and fascinating afternoon. So stick with us. I'm now going to introduce more formally Rick Hess and Pedro Noguera, and ask them to begin a conversation that I am going to moderate. And at the end of that conversation, we're going to open the microphone, so to speak, but we're doing it remotely, so it will be indirect microphones, and have you ask your questions and make your comments about this. So let me just give a little more background about our two leading thinkers here. Frederick Hess is a senior fellow and director of educational policy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on K-12 and higher education issues. Rick is the author of Education Week's popular blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, and is a regular contributor to Forbes magazine and The Hill, and he serves as the executive editor of the Education Next magazine. Dr. Hess started his career as a high school social studies teacher. He's the author of many books and articles, holds an MA and a PhD in government and an MED in teaching and curriculum from Harvard University. And our second dialogue speaker will be Dr. Pedro Noguera, who's the Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education and a distinguished professor of education at the University of Southern California. Dr. Noguera is an elected member of the National Academy of Education, the Phi Delta Kappa Honor Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A sociologist, his research focuses on the ways schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. Prior to joining USC, Dr. Noguera was Distinguished Professor of Education in the Graduate School of Education at UCLA and a professor at New York University. He's also taught at Harvard, University of California, Berkeley, and was elected to the school board in Berkeley and taught in the Oakland public schools. So with no more ado, I'd like to introduce Pedro Noguera, who has now joined us, and Rick Hess, whose picture we should be seeing momentarily. There's Rick. Okay, great. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for agreeing to enter into this conversation. And I'd like to begin by just asking you to react to what I thought was a very significant statement from the federal judge in this litigation that we brought. And that was Judge Smith's statement that American democracy is in peril today. And the judge indicated that a robust civic education is the first defense against the degeneration of democracy. Would each of you agree with that statement? And if you do, it'd be very helpful for us to understand your perspective on what the perils of democracy are today and how civic education can and should relate to that. So whichever of you would like to answer that question first, please do.
Dean?
Thanks, Rick. And great to see you, Michael, and thanks for having us. I've been a long time admirer of your work, and so appreciate the opportunity to speak at this session. So on the face of it, I would agree with the quote, but I think it's the threats to democracy come from lots of places. I think what Rick and I have tried to show in this book is why civil discourse that is not just about debate, but about actually listening to each other is so key. And our hope is that not just in civics courses, but certainly there, that we can model that for kids, that kids can learn how to use evidence to support their ideas. They can learn how to listen to the other side and understand that there are more than one ways to look at an issue. And so that's what we try to model in the book and in the podcast and subsequent talks we've done, because I think what he and I both share, one of the things we share is that we're both former social studies teachers, but the other thing we share is I think we're pragmatists about things, and we understand that particularly in education, a lot of the issues are very complex, and the way we often frame them in very dichotomous kind of black-white terms doesn't really work and doesn't help us to understand the issues, much less to move forward and solve them. And so I think that's what both of us are committed to.
Great, thank you. Rick?
Yeah, and I think that, as always, Pedro said it well. Look, I mean, let's keep in mind, a free nation is never more than one generation from not being a free nation. We have been enormously fortunate. We have been blessed by more than 2 centuries of constitutional democracy, and we have done it better and brought more people into the process, generation by generation. But there's no guarantees. So of course it's at risk. It's always at risk. A free nation is what we make of. And I think one of the things that, one of the huge challenges, and like Pedro said, the one we try to take on, is that there are habits of civic behavior that I think are essential to sustaining a free nation and having it flourish. There are behaviors where we have been fortunate that the machinery of government, from the makeup of the national, of Congress, to federalism, to the design of the Supreme Court, to the Electoral College, to so much that we've inherited, has been shaped in a way that has pushed Americans over the centuries to have to learn to engage and share and listen. And I think one of the problems of the last couple of decades is that we've been given a lot of blessings that we don't know how to handle. Social media lets us talk to each other, but lets us talk to each other anonymously and without intermediaries and in real time without having to think what we're saying. It makes life enormously performative. And it turns out when people can perform and do that all day, they like to. And the people who do the most performing are the most maladjusted and narcissistic among us. And that creates huge distortions in the way we think and talk about issues. And so I think for me, and I think for Pedro too, a big part of what we've tried to do in this book is remind people that there are productive, healthy, known ways to wrestle with, honest, principled disagreement about something like schooling. And that's a huge part of what schools are here for.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. Let me try to get into some of the concrete issues where I'd like to probe to see how much there is agreement or if there's disagreement between the two of you, what those disagreements are and how to handle them. I think you've both said that as social studies teachers, what you try to do and what you think social studies teachers should be doing is combining a respect for America's ideals of liberty and equality, but at the same time bring to students' attention that our country has not has never actually fully lived up to those ideals. So those general principles, I think most people would agree on, but I want to push it a little. Let me put it this way. Do you think it's fair to say that America has been plagued by systemic racism over the years, and that this is an issue that should be specifically told, brought to the attention of students in social studies classes when we speak about the ideals and the fact that the ideals have not been lived up to?
Why don't you go first, Rick?
Okay. I mean, partly it's a matter of definitions. I mean, certainly the United States had legalized slavery for the first 70 odd years of our national existence, 80 years. That's systemic racism. Certainly Jim Crow and, Reconstruction were examples of systemic racism. Are disparities in income, disparities in accumulated net worth, disparities in employment evidence of systemic racism? I don't think so on their face. I think they are evidence of opportunities we have to more fully live up to our dreams. But I'm not sure systemic racism is a particularly useful descriptive term, and B, most of the people who seem interested in using it, as best I can tell, see more interest in scoring ideological points than either in promoting constructive civic discourse or problem solving. I think of Ibram Kendi, whose notion of combating systemic racism is an anti-racism, which is a political doctrine. Kendi will tell you there is a specific right and wrong answer on marginal tax rates, on capital gains taxes. He offers a specific right and wrong racist answer on pot legalization. There's a specific right and wrong answer on high stakes accountability. As far as I can tell, that's indistinguishable from a political agenda. So, it's a term that I think encompasses multitudes and used in ways that foster reflection and thought. I think the notion of systemic racism can be useful. The way it's generally bandied about in education circles today by advocates and foundations and the rest, I don't find it particularly helpful.
Okay.
Can I jump in? So where I would agree with Rick is I think it's not helpful to just throw out racism as a charge as often as it is. I think that actually makes it almost meaningless, and it is not particularly helpful for shedding light on what's going on. Where we disagree is really in how we understand systemic racism. Systemic racism is alive and well in America today. Think about this. In almost every city and town in America, there are what we call ghettos, right? Where poor people, disproportionately Black or Latino, live, although they got a lot of poor whites in poverty. That's a legacy of slavery, of segregation, of redlining, but it continues to show up in unequal access to healthcare. So Black children, for example, in America, more likely to have asthma than any other group. Black people, Native Americans have lower life expectancies, not because we're less healthy, but because of the conditions in our lives, which are a byproduct of that history. Now, had we been committed as a nation to addressing that systemic, the roots of that problem, we'd be in a very different place. I often point out to people, you go to Canada, and I don't want to romanticize Canada by any means, but Canada doesn't have ghettos. You go right across the river from Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, where we had the truckers not long ago. You see a thriving Black community, right? That's also in a city based on the auto industry. How do you explain the difference between Windsor and Detroit? Well, it's about history and about opportunity. And if you think about the way education is provided in Canada versus the United States, what you start to see is that the deeply segregated schools, the deep inequity that we accept as normal, doesn't exist there. So I think that we've got to be willing to look at evidence, but we also have to be careful in how we characterize those who we disagree with. To me, simply throwing out accusations of racism doesn't really help a lot in advancing discourse or in helping us to solve problems. And so this is where I would agree with Rick. We have to be more careful in how we frame issues, how we explain them, especially to kids in schools, because I think there's real danger in kind of being superficial and glossing over an understanding of American history and why we are the kind of society we are today that is so deeply divided.
Okay, let me push another aspect of this. Rick, you were indicating that there are some people who are throwing around these terms, using them in inappropriate ways. I mentioned in my opening remarks that 11 states now have passed statutes that restrict teaching certain specific doctrines, using certain books like the 1619 report, and approaching topics in a certain way that some students may feel sensitive to. Are those examples of people who are misusing these terms and these labels? Is that legislation helpful in any way, or is it not helpful?
Again, what I want to, I'm not sure that we've been having this debate on a particularly constructive plane. I mean, this is one of the places Pedro and I keep coming back to. Those 11 bills, there's some pretty substantial differences between them. And so the fact that they all get characterized as this thing or that thing, I think ignores the fact that I think some of those bills are healthy and constructive and other of those bills are deeply problematic. Look, to bring it back, first off, I think one of the places that Pedro and I absolutely agree, and I thought he said just that beautifully, is history matters. I mean, that's when we talk about history and civics, that it absolutely does shape our circumstances. And obviously Pedro is right about, the history of the American ghetto and the Great Migration and how that played out and redlining and, hell, the creation of the interstate highway system and which neighborhoods that went through and which neighborhoods it isolated. These are all true and important historical developments to talk about. On the other hand, there's nothing unique about, Pedro's right that, well, I assume Pedro's right because Pedro's right about things, but I have deeply at Municipal Canada. But, it's generally true that around the world, every nation and every major metropolis has ghettos. Go visit Paris. Now, the ghettos in Paris are on the suburbs rather than the inner city, but go to Germany, go to France. I mean, the idea that there's something uniquely American about a ghetto is nuts. Go to Asia, go to Africa. There are ghettos in every nation and every major city. Now, who lives in those ghettos and the relationships and why those ghettos look like they do are important questions. So for me, again, if we're thinking about why does the US look like it does? How does this play out? How do we do a better job of ensuring that the blessings of liberty attach equally to every child? These are good questions. But I fear that, again, to take the 1619 project, I'm fine with students engaging in history, even history that I think, is empirically problematic. But it's also the case that the individual responsible for this 1619 project has sketched that this is a vision of America as a slaveocracy, has been pretty explicit about that. I don't see that as an effort to ask students to engage in history. That's editorializing. And just as it was a problem when we used to tell children that American history was all, unicorns and rainbows, I think it's a problem to editorialize, it's more of a problem to editorialize kids that their nation is a venal slaveocracy. Let's talk about the aspirations, the opportunities, and how to wrestle with it. So some of these laws, look, the laws which try to censor what schools can talk about, I think are deeply problematic. On the other hand, and I don't support them. I think schools should engage in evidence and should talk about hard questions. And even though I have deep problems with this 1619 project, I am okay with them, okay with those materials being used. But I think it's absolutely appropriate that state legislatures say that schools have to abide by the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says that you cannot harass children based on ethnicity or race. So to ask students based on ethnicity or race to go through struggle sessions, to put them to put fifth graders or seventh graders in environments where they're taking steps forward and back based on their pigmentation, or whether their parents are married, or whether they have books in their home, strikes me as the antithesis of engaging in a respectful way with questions. And it seems very much about promoting an ideological notion, a Manichaean notion of the oppressed and the oppressor, which doesn't strike me as an effort to understand these issues or promote civic virtues, but strikes me again as something much more akin to a political ideology.
Okay, well, let me turn the floor back.
Can I respond to your question too, Michael, before we?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask my version of how you should respond, but please, you respond on your own. And if you don't cover what I wanted to get to, I'll ask you to cover that too.
Okay,
Thank
all
you.
right. I won't talk too long, but I just want to point out the irony of the moment. So not long ago, many conservatives were criticizing liberal universities for trigger warnings and for shutting down, conservative writers and professors, and that's still an issue. And I think we should all be concerned about. I really believe diversity in thought should be encouraged. We should be encouraging open debate and discussion. And as long as we're not practicing hate speech, we should actively encourage free expression of ideas. Your university needs to represent that. But what's happening now is the same people who are concerned about trigger warnings, they say, my kids are triggered by learning about racism. They shouldn't have to learn about that. They shouldn't have to learn about transgendered people or the fact they have a kid in the class with two mothers. This is absurd. This is an attempt to not only silence the past, but also to deny the existence of diversity around sexuality in their communities. And it's an overreach that is going to, again, we'll see the pendulum swing the other way. I also want to point out, our schools are on the forefront of addressing very complex social issues. And we saw this when schools desegregated, they got no guidance on how do we bring communities together peacefully? How do kids learn together? They're still trying to figure this stuff out. So Rick is right. Some of the stuff I see going on in the name of anti-racism and helping deal with implicit bias, I think it's bogus. And I think it's not helpful. But I also am sympathetic to the educators. They're trying to figure stuff out. They don't know. They don't want to see kids at war with each other or engaged in name calling. And they're not getting good guidance. So, the states, the federal government have a responsibility to be helpful. Not to ban books, but to guide, say, look, what's an appropriate age to talk to kids about gender and about race? I'm not sure. Let's let our developmental psychologists weigh in here, say, what can kids really handle appropriately? But shutting things down is not the way to go about it in a democratic society. And what we're seeing now is on the right, an attempt to force one agenda in education. And I'll bet you parents and kids and teachers will reject it because they believe in the right to free ideas, free information, and that's a key to democracy.
Hey, Pedro, so you
not to have a role in this discussion.
So, as you get into the legislation about, say gender, so, obviously, I think, you probably have the Florida legislation on your mind, seems, So, but look, we both have, right? I got a second grader, your youngest, a little older than that. Look, when I read with my kid, I read Mary Poppins with them, and I'm reading Narnia. I don't want to talk about gender or sexuality, and I don't want school to do that. We talk a lot about schools being democratic institutions. I understand your point about banning books. I'm with you. I understand your point about not, saying schools can't deal with these things. It strikes me that most teachers I've known, most first and second grade teachers aren't real eager to talk about gender and sexuality. And so I'm actually, that's what the law actually says, right? It says you can't talk about identity and gender and sexuality with students in grades K to 3. It seems to me that if the elected officials want to sketch that out, just like we used to say, you don't do sex education until 10th grade, that strikes me as appropriate. If they were saying, look, we're going to have some kind of speech code for teachers up and down through school about how, I'd be with you. But this strikes me as an effort to sketch some notion of age appropriateness, because conservatives like me have seen some trainings and some behaviors which have led us to be nervous, not so much about teachers. I don't think a lot of second grade teachers want to talk about this, but some of what is being pushed by folks whose agendas are not necessarily creating a comfortable classroom for 7 and 8-year-olds. I don't know, curious, just kind of push back on me, man.
So I'm not sure how you talk about it, but I do know this. My kids, like your kids, are going to school with other kids who have parents of the same gender, right? And sometimes they show up and the kids are curious. They say, how come he calls both his parents daddy and both their parents mommy? And so how do parents talk about that? They say, oh, don't look. Or do we say, guess what? There are families that are different out there, just like they're, so I think some intelligent guidance to educators and parents would be helpful. That's not based in fear and bias. And that's where I think education needs help, because our schools are trying to figure this stuff out on their own. And it's very easy to offend people or to, when you didn't mean to. And I see it happen all the time. I had Black parents who said they didn't want their kids to learn about Rosa Parks because they don't want their kids to feel as though they have to sit in the back of the bus. And I'm trying to understand where they're coming from. They said, because they want their kids to be proud. I said, but the kids also need to understand history. I said, but not at 5. So, okay. So I don't know when is the right age to teach kids things. I'm not sure. I do know that school is a place where kids are learning lots of things. And some of what they're learning is reinforcing bias, but some of what they're learning is helping us to undo it. My hope is that schools can be a place where kids learn to become more tolerant, to more empathetic, places where they're less likely to embrace the racist attitudes of their parents, which we all know are still very much out there. So, but for that to happen, schools need help.
So, so there we're on the same, so I mean, aspirationally, I think, right, this is where it's easy to find agreement, is aspirationally. And look, I mean, what I would say is, here's where I think a lot of the folks who, are working under the broad umbrella of equity have actually made this worse. That because they have approached this, the Wisconsin situation came to light the other day, where there was trainings where teachers were counseled very directly, don't let parents know that we're doing this. Where middle school teachers were told to look for kids and try to recruit them into, clubs that were going to deal with issues of gender identity, but make sure parents don't know that you're inviting the students to this. That breeds that breeds suspicion and disrespect. And, I've seen some of the comments popping up about, legislators should keep their noses out. All right. But that's also, if those of you who spend much time talking to police, that was for a long time the attitude of police about body cameras, that this should be a decision, professional judgment. Legislators don't know what it's like to walk a beat. They don't understand the rigors of the job. But at a certain point, the people's representatives say, we're paying the bill. We're responsible for what goes on. We have a right to craft legislation that says you need to wear cameras because you have lost we are no longer confident that all your judgments are good ones. And I think that's what's happened here. And again, I think the vast majority of teachers left to their own devices aren't eager to wade into this stuff and want to make the kinds of nuanced, kind of student-centered kind of calls you're talking about, Pedro. Let's answer this question in a way that, but I do think that many of the people who have fancied themselves as advocates in this realm approach it in a way that is more hostile to those of us on the right. It doesn't seem especially understanding, that tends to be dismissive of some of the concerns that get raised, and that has unsurprising consequences.
Well, let's turn to this question of legislation from another point of view. I'm just wondering, Rick, you know, on the one hand, you said earlier that you don't agree with the approach of many of these laws because it is constraining what teachers can do in the classroom. On the other hand, you understand that in a democracy, a legislature has the right and maybe the responsibility to respond when an institution like the schools has gotten far from what the people who elected them think is appropriate. I'm wondering if either of you would have an idea of how legislatures could be helpful if they were approaching this issue more from a pedagogical point of view, wrestling with the questions that we're all wrestling with. And one of those questions is diversity. Now, Pedro indicated a number of ideas about how you might be able to teach kids in a classroom to respect the different cultures people come from, put things together. Is this something that legislatures should be affirmatively thinking about and telling schools things that they should be doing? California, for instance, has recently mandated ethnic studies. New York has put out regulations on cultural awareness in the curriculum. Are these positive steps? Pedro, why don't you respond to that first? Because I think I know what your response is going to be, and then we'll see what Rick's comment after that is.
So, you know, truthfully, I was critical of the ethnic studies law. And the reason why is because teachers aren't even trained to teach ethnic studies. So you could pass a law saying teach it, but then where are the teachers? Where are the materials? Going back to what is developmentally appropriate? So for example, if you want to teach ethnic studies, and I think, so let me start by saying kids have a need and a right to learn about their identity and the identity of others. And it is a shame that so many kids know so little about Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, right? Because that's not been historically part of the way we teach history in school. But if you introduce ethnic studies in middle school or high school, before kids have even been exposed to American history, how are they going to make sense of the civil rights movement? How are they going to make sense to, you know, you have to understand how kids use knowledge and make sense of it. And so I think while I agree with the intent, I am very concerned about the implementation. And I think that, you know, I've seen so many cases where legislatures try to do the right thing, but don't understand the consequences of what they're doing in schools with kids, with teachers. And I think this ethnic studies law is a perfect example. Most teachers are not trained to teach ethnic studies, right?
How about culturally
and there's no
responsive
materials for
curricula?
them.
How about culturally responsive curricula, which are being imposed on schools in a number of states? Is that something that you would favor?
In a vague sense, yes, except that we have to define what does that mean? And what does it look like when it's done well? Yeah, we want teachers to be culturally responsive. We want them to be responsive in every way to kids, okay? But we have to be careful about these terms and make sure we're really clear about what it means so that we're giving good guidance. You know, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who you know and is a good friend, when she writes about it, you know, a lot of people react, say, well, what you're describing is simply good teaching. And she says, yeah, that's what good teaching looks like. We're challenging kids. We're making them feel like they're accepted. We're helping them to understand their identity. Yeah, that's good teaching. If that's what we're calling culturally responsive education, hard for me to see how a reasonable person could take issue with that.
Okay, Rick, you're a reasonable person. Do you take issue with any of that?
Oh, it's the first time somebody's called me reasonable on one of these calls in a very long time, I think. Look, no, I mean, I think one of the problems here is, for some reason, in education, there seems to be a profound naivete, because I could say like misapprehension, but I'll say, because naivete is a nice word. People mean about what legislation actually does. I mean, go read a bill sometimes. Bills are long things. They have lots of paragraphs. They go sometimes dozens or hundreds of pages, because when you write a law, you have to write it for everywhere, for everybody in that political entity, every school, every child in that state or in that nation. This is the opposite of pedagogy. Of course, legislation should not be influenced by pedagogy, because pedagogy is all about judgment in the moment. It's all about figuring out where a student is, what a student needs. It's about diagnosis and intervention. It's about support. It's about knowing which kid needs a hand on the shoulder and which kid needs their space. It's about knowing when to say something and when to be. These are what make good teachers, right? This is what make good schools, a million little judgment calls. Nothing is further from legislation or rules than any of that. So one, of course, so part of the problem here is as soon as you start getting legislatures involved in these conversations, whether it is anti-CRT stuff, whether it's the Florida legislation. For those of you, I think I've seen a couple of who don't know the Florida legislation, it's the one that has been labeled "Don't Say Gay," which has nothing to do with the content of the legislation. I don't know why it's labeled that, except from like some good oppo kind of media stuff from Democrats in Tallahassee. You know, being precise about what legislation is good at is two things. It's telling you what you must do and what you must not do, and spending money. Everything else, legislation's bad. And look, so what that means is, of course, these conversations are best when they're handled by educators in school districts and schools, you know. And so that's why I think Pedro is exactly right, like on the ethnic studies. And look, aspirationally, I think Pedro and I are in the same place. Every word he said about what we should try to do in terms of helping students wrestle with these issues, make sense of their identity, make sense of their classmates, every student feel comfortable and valued and part of the, all I can do is say, amen. How we do that, how to weave that in, I think is where we start to have good faith disagreements. And if we would treat those as honest kind of questions about what's right, what resources should be included, what shouldn't be included, I think this is a really healthy, constructive conversation. Again, I fear that too many advocates in this space, and partly because I think in my experience, the space that we're talking about, the folks who are doing teacher preparation and working in ed schools and funding these projects and doing these projects, you know, I think well over 85, 90% of them self-identify as progressive. We wind up not having very much healthy, constructive back and forth. And so things get done, and then it's not until after the fact when a lot of non-progressives start to see them and lash out at them. And then by then, instead of a constructive, serious pedagogical conversation, it's one more clash in the culture war.
Can I jump in just to share a
Sure.
quick anecdote? So about 30 years ago, I served on the school board as an elected board member in Berkeley, California. And one of the things we had to do was to adopt social studies textbooks. And here's the challenge. If you didn't adopt the books that the state had approved, you were stuck with the old books, which everybody said was worse. So I'm perusing, you know, the new textbooks, fourth graders, and it starts with Columbus discovered America. Now, think about that statement alone. You can only discover a place that's uninhabited. If it's already inhabited, then you encountered it, right? So I'm like, you know, this is like problematic. But what are we to do here, right? In my opinion, the solution lies in helping teachers to know how to deal with a problematic text, right? So they can help kids to understand, no, you can't, you can only discover a place if you think the people who were there are not human, okay? That they were savages. If they were humans, then you encountered a place. So you have to, teachers have to be prepared to engage material that's problematic. And so Rick brought up the 1619 project. The best way to deal with it, if you think that it's too one-sided, then you bring in another set of material and have kids analyze it, critique it, discuss it, debate it, so they're able to sift through different ideas rather than being told there's one version of the truth and here it is. That's what is wrong with American democracy today. We get our truths from different channels and we can't even talk to each other. Some Americans, anyway, I could go on and on, but we got.
All right, let's see if I'd just like to switch the conversation to another topic that is sensitive in this area of civic education. That's the concept of patriotism. And, you know, I referred back to Horace Mann and all our traditional thinkers. In the 19th century, most of the 20th century, one thing schools did is emphasize patriotism and imbue those values in kids. These days, I think schools shy away from that because there's a lot of sensitivity on all sides, what patriotism means, how we can teach it, how we should approach it. What I want to ask you is the recent experience, I shouldn't say recent, we're still living through it, the Ukrainian situation, which has fired everybody's imagination about a vision of patriotism. Those are people who are willing to put their lives on the line. And from everything we see, the overwhelming mass of the population there, many people have said that's an inspiration that Americans should pick up now. That's what patriotism means. What can we learn from that Ukrainian experience, if anything? And how do you think schools should approach the question of patriotism in the 21st century? Rick, would you like to address that first?
Sure. I mean, you know, there was the Quinnipiac survey a week or two ago, you know, asked Americans if the United States were invaded by Russia, land forces like we've seen in Ukraine, would you fight or would you leave the country? And about 60% of Americans said they'd fight, I believe. A majority of Americans under age 40 said they would leave the country rather than fight. You know, Quinnipiac's a serious established. Look, I mean, I think it's a question of civilizational confidence. I think if you go around much of the world, and certainly around Europe, people are delighted that the United States is here. They think we are essential. Go spend much time in South Korea or Japan or Taiwan or Australia, nations that worry about, you know, the authoritarian rulers of China. They're very glad the United States is here and they value our contribution to the world. I think frequently Americans are much less confident that we are actually a constructive and healthy force in the world than are people who are not here. And I think, frankly, as you go around the United States, the people who are in positions of the most influence, often in education and the elite universities and the heads of education foundations and advocacy groups are much more uncertain about whether America is a good place than are many of the people who live in America, if you look at the polling on this. So look, I think it's a question of civilizational confidence. I don't know exactly what patriotism means. I mean, one of the problems, like Pedro, and I think has pointed out, is a lot of this gets caught up in definitions. Is patriotism like wearing a USA t-shirt and banging your chest? I don't know. I don't care about that. I do want people to appreciate what we have inherited, what has been built, the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf, the good that we have done in the world. If you want to call that something other than patriotism, that's fine by me. And for me, it's a larger point. I mean, we've spent, you know, the first 40 minutes of this conversation talking about important tensions that Americans argue over. Honestly, for me, the things that make for good civics education, to go back to your federal judge, Michael, that we started with, is, you know, I think there are civic virtues, civilizational values that are essential to whether the United States will be a healthy, robust republic a century from now. Are we inculcating a sense of humility in our children? Like Pedro said, a sense of a tolerance for one another, a sense of gratitude for what we've inherited, and a sense that we've got to take care of it, take care of the environment, take care of our neighbors, build our communities. Is there a sense of duty? Is there an appreciation that George Washington was asked to become a monarch and down? I mean, we have a Cincinnatus who founded this nation. How often do we talk about that as a model for what it looks like to be that's what leadership looks like. And so for me, I guess I'm less worried about the label patriotism than I am about whether when we talk about civics education, we're actually talking about the values that underlie a healthy civic nation.
So let me give you an example of how I think we can deal with the contradictions of American history. So in World War II, while Japanese Americans were being interned in many parts of this country, many Japanese American men served in the US military and fought and died in that war. They were willing to sacrifice their lives for this country at a time when their people were taken away from their land and put into camps. That contradiction needs to be explored by our students. They could understand it. Wow, how could that have been fair to do that to those people? And why would they still have given their lives in defense of this country? This happened, and our kids are capable of understanding these contradictions. You know, one of the things I enjoyed about the play, Alexander Hamilton, was the ways in which it brings American history to life. And while there's a lot they don't, like, for example, one of the things they don't address is that the British promised and did free many of the Blacks who served in with the British forces against the Americans, and ended up going to Nova Scotia to live, and later to Sierra Leone. You know, the contradictions of American history actually make it more interesting, would make it more appealing to kids than the way it's typically taught, as a bunch of dates and facts and a history of American wars and generals. And so, you know, the goal should not be to teach love of country. The goal should be to teach an appreciation of this country, how it's been made, and with a focus on the future. How do we make the country more just, more fair, better than we found it? I think if that were what we were trying to do, then out of that might come a greater appreciation for being a part of this country and not feeling as though your history has been silenced or denied.
Okay, you know, I want to probe a little more. Both of you have kind of indicated that if we somehow left more of the teaching of civics to the teachers in the classroom, and a little less input coming from legislators and people who have different agendas, we might be better off. Let me take a particular example. I think you would both agree that it would be very healthy for our civic education if more teachers were instructing students in how to deal with controversial issues, discussions, debates in the classroom on speaking with people with whom you have a different view, having respect for that type of conversation, trying to reach common ground, really modeling themselves after what the two of you have been doing this afternoon and on many other occasions. But that ideal is very seldom reached, as far as I can tell, and we'll have Diana Hess addressing this in a little while also, and she's one of the great experts in this area, and I think Diana will agree, very few social studies are doing exactly that. How do we give teachers more of this training? How do we give them more of this motivation? How do we get parents in the community who may hear that their kids are discussing the 1619 project in their school, even though they've been given the 1776 project as an offset along the lines of what Pedro was saying? How do we get this to really happen? How do we build a better civic education atmosphere in our schools?
It's hard, you know, because the real question right now is how do we convince people to be teachers? Because the job of a teacher has become so undesirable, so unappealing. And so I'm worried about that. But as a former social studies teacher, I would say we want to make sure teachers understand how to use primary sources, right? And so again, let history come to life. When I was a brand new social studies teacher in Providence, Rhode Island, my mentor teacher said, your job is to get the kids from the Revolutionary War in September to the Vietnam War in June. Right? And when I said, well, what about the Constitution? He said, don't get caught up in the Constitution. It's too complicated, and you got to be at the Civil War by Christmas. Well, then it became clear to me, he didn't care if kids actually learned history. What he cared about was covering the book. And I fear that a lot of kids experience history in that way, where they cover the book, but the depth of ideas don't latch on. You know, so Rick and I recently talked about the situation in Ukraine. The sad thing is most Americans don't know geography, don't know history. So how can they make sense of the current conflict without that background knowledge. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think social studies and civics courses can play a role, but we've got to do a better job of preparing our teachers for how to do this work in a way that doesn't teach kids what to think, but how to use evidence, how to think critically about the evidence that they see on, for example, on the internet. We know there's a lot of misinformation out there. Those are the key skills that kids need to acquire, but if teachers don't have them, then our kids won't get them either.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pedro is exactly, absolutely right. And let me add a few things. One, I think, look, one of the things that's changed over the decades is the way we consume media. If you were a kid in 1985 or 1995, the amount of news, the number of images that washed over you on a given day was a tiny fraction of what comes today. There's enormous noise. And people are bombarded with language in which people are trying to stand out of this ocean of stimuli. And so that rewards people who are extreme and outrageous and performative. And so that's a lot of what kids see. So how do we use the educational experience as a way to give kids a model of something else? One of the things Pedro and I talk about in the book and that we've reflected about a lot is that, so much of our communication, even as scholars, is, we're on radio or you're on TV or you're doing a podcast or you're doing this. And a lot of it's about trying to get the killer line. And, as I'm watching all the little chat box stuff and all the people about what a monster that Hess guy is and what an idiot he is, it's very tempting to try to respond with, a one-liner or to just announce it. And it takes a lot of discipline to not do that. It takes a lot of discipline to say, look, people are going to react, but let's try to see where we are, where we agree, where we disagree. Kids need models of that. They need to see examples of adults who do that. They need to be introduced to leaders who have done that. I mean, one of the things that I found so dispiriting about like the San Francisco school renaming is like, Abraham Lincoln it should be an avatar of somebody who thought and reasoned and engaged and listened deeply. We shouldn't be taking his name off of schools. We should be introducing students to leaders who have, who made a fine art out of this. So that's one thing. A second thing is the modes of communication. Social media turns out, I think, to be horrific for developing the skills and mindsets that make for good interaction. So how do we do less of that? How do we get kids off of Twitter, off of TikTok? Not Twitter so much, right? These kids. How do we get them off of TikTok? How do we get them off of Facebook? How do we get them off of whatever they're on and spend more time engaging one-on-one in conversation? How do we build that into the school rhythm, into the routine? How do we make sure that more of the trainings we're doing with civics teachers are around our aspirational values for civic engagement? How do we teach kids things like humility and perseverance? And make sure that this is, if we're talking about these sensitive issues that we spent the first 40 minutes on, and we're doing it in a way where we're constantly being pushed to model the kinds of civic engagement that we're talking about, I think you get a much more constructive, much more useful conversation. It's not just legislatures shouldn't do this, Michael, of course, because the problem is there's hundreds of thousands of teachers who at least teach some civics or social studies in the course of a day. There's 3.5 million teachers who are trying to do this. And so, legislatures are going to intervene when you get a lot of pressure to do something. So partly just to keep the busybody politicians out, there should be a huge incentive for this community to try to do a better job of equipping and supporting the teachers in this work.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question, then open it up to our audience, and I'm sure I'm going to get a quick response from both of you on this. We've been talking about legislatures intervening, and as you know, our organization has been saying we would do well to have courts intervene. What do you guys think? Would a court order that made education a higher priority be something helpful or not helpful?
Say that again, Michael.
If a court said students have a right to an adequate civic education, and said we're going to hold schools' feet to the fire. We're not going to tell them how to do it, but they got to do a better job and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Would that be a helpful intervention?
No.
No. All right.
That's
And
too
Rick, I
vague.
think I've had this conversation with you before.
Yeah, again, I admire the aspiration, but all of my concerns about getting legislatures into this are double when we talk about the courts.
Well, all I'll say on that, I'm going to make my last comment going back to my first one about my friend Judge Smith, who wrote 50 pages of eloquent, enlightened understanding of what civic education is. I haven't seen too many legislators who have that depth of knowledge. But in any event, I want to see what the students and teachers and others who have been listening to this want to ask you to. So I think we have a first question from a high school student. Layla?
Hi, my name is Kareem. I'm a high school senior from West Bloomfield, Michigan. In your experience, what is the youth looking for in terms of civic education?
Okay, did everybody hear that? What is the youth looking for in terms of civic education?
I'll briefly say, I think it's information they can use, that they can use to help inform them about, so they can better understand the world, better understand the society they live in, and better participate as a citizen, so they're able to vote intelligently and make sense of information that they encounter.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm just saying the same thing another way. I think it's feeling part of the community, feeling like they're part of this, not just victims of it, and then feeling like they've got some sense. How do they actually make a difference at it?
Okay, and now do we have a question from a teacher?
We have actually a few questions from the audience that I'll go ahead and relay. First question is, one of our viewers would like to ask the speakers why they left the social studies classroom.
Want to go first, Rick?
Sure. I did a whole chapter in my letters to young ed reformer on this, if you're actually interested. In a more, I mean, mostly that, I went into teaching because I love I love the stuff of history and civics and social studies, because I love the idea of talking to a bunch of 9th and 10th graders about it all day, because I love trying to develop interesting ways to teach this stuff. Like my book on this, bringing social sciences alive kind of stuff. And I found that I was spending little or no time doing any of that, and spending, we introduced in Louisiana a 136-point teacher evaluation system my very first year in the classroom. I was, constantly dealing with, fighting with the administration to do the stuff that they said we were going to do. And I was like, wrestling with bureaucratic frustrations is not something that I want to spend my time doing.
Yeah, I just say briefly, I didn't go to college wanting to be a teacher. I kind of accidentally took a course, a psychology course that involved going into schools and working with a teacher and kids. And I found that work to be so intriguing and so interesting that I said, well, let me get a credential. But my commitment was always to doing something different. And I ended up going right away into a PhD program. But while I was in the PhD program at Berkeley, I continued to teach high school because I found it gratifying. I still find working in schools, teaching kids to be gratifying and important. So it wasn't like I fled because it was too hard. It was that I had other interests, but I was always, and I continue to be drawn back to schools because I believe schools are so important. And so, I'm a dean, I'm not a teacher, but I'm in schools still now, especially now the pandemic's over. I'm in schools all the time, talking to teachers, talking to kids, trying to figure out how to support them in doing this work.
Hey, Layla, next question, please.
Thank you. The next question is, what allies or partners do educators need in the quest to ensure all students get a high quality civic education?
What are the qualities they need, or
What allies
or partners do educators need?
I'm asking, Pedro, I want to hear your answer.
Well, I'm hoping that we can be an ally, right? I think universities should be allies to schools. and we should be able to help in providing resources, professional development to teachers that's helpful and useful on how to make the material useful, relevant, meaningful to their students. You know, universities, it's always disturbed me that we have so many great universities and they're often located right next to schools that are struggling. And the universities, you know, have no commitment or do very little to really help those schools. I think that's what we've got to change. In my role as dean, that's what I'm working on changing.
So, you know, I think one is partly a question of frame of how to think about finding the allies is, well, I got somebody accused me of like manufacturing the numbers a moment ago. And I'll just say, if you don't think that there's a heavy progressive tilt in schools of education and these advocacy groups, there's actually data on this. There's work on political identification of folks in universities and schools of education that you can go look up. And I did a paper a couple of years ago, Education Next with Jay Green, where we looked at the folks in education advocacy, and 98%, I think, of Gates grantees identified left, and it was like 80-some% of Walton. So I don't usually try to make stuff up. I mean, you can disagree with me, but I try to play it straight. But what I can say, because it's a similar note, is, look, I think the conversation around so much today, including civics ed, tends to be dominated by the screamers at other side. They're the ones, if you've seen the studies on who uses Twitter, it tends to be the people who scream loudest. If you look at who gets invited onto Fox or MSNBC, they're the most extreme members in Congress. They don't represent, I firmly believe, 70, 80% of the nation. The vast majority of the nation is sick of this craziness, but it gets drowned out. So who should be the allies for social studies teachers who want to do civics in a serious, responsible, constructive way? There's a lion's share of people who are tuning out, who are frustrated, who want people to kind of focus on giving their kids and their communities the opportunities to live healthy, serious, reasonable lives. And these folks, you don't find them on social media, and they're not the ones screaming at school boards, but they're out there in communities. And I think if you're proactive, if you're reaching out through the PTA, if you're actually proactively reaching out to the members in school boards and legislatures who aren't on one side or the other, you're going to find a huge number of allies who have been sitting this fight out because they don't want to sign up for either extreme.
Okay, thank you. Layla, I think we have time for about one more question.
Okay. Do either of you have a stance or view on the Civic Secures Democracy Act? And do you think it has a chance of passing?
What has a chance of passing?
The Civic Secures Democracy Act.
I'm not familiar with it. So.
It's a federal bill that would give about $1 billion a year in funding for civic education, among other things. Rick, you're close to Washington.
Yeah, I'm the adult, you know, the swamp denizen. You know, I mean, it's got bipartisan sponsorship, but I think especially in the right, there's a lot of skepticism. Certainly nothing's moving this year. And if you've been reading the polls, given what the House is likely to look like after November, it's hard to imagine it moving before 2024 at the earliest, 2025. So I don't think it's likely to move, but you know, you never know for sure. You know, I'm mixed. I tend to be skeptical about the value of federal legislation. Where, you know, our kids already owe an extraordinary sum of money. You know, when I'm going to embrace legislation, I want to be confident it's well spent. I'm not confident on this yet. I'm not sure that the programmatic stuff, but I'm not against it. I'm certainly not for it. I'm kind of mixed.
Okay, Rick, Pedro, anything you want to add on that one?
Not on that one. Just enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate Rick and his openness and as you saw, our ability to talk openly about these important issues.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank both of you. This was really a wonderful conversation and a wonderful model for everything you're talking about. This is what civics conversations should be like. And if we can find a way to move this kind of conversation into our classrooms, we would have accomplished much of what all of us are aspiring to. So the last thing I'll say is that Rick and Pedro have jointly authored a book. The name of it escapes me. Can one of you promote it a little?
Search for Common Ground, Teachers College Press.
Okay, there you are. You all ought to go out and buy it. Put it in the chat, Layla, so people can find it. They speak about civic education. They speak about a lot of other really important topics. And it's a model we ought to use in our social studies classes about how people of goodwill who have different places on the political spectrum can engage in democratic dialogue in a very productive way. So thank you again. I'd like to now introduce Peter Levine, who is going to
thanks, Michael. Take care, Pedro.
Thank you. Thank you both again. And Peter, as I mentioned earlier, is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life. That is quite an impressive long title, Peter. But what I know about Peter is he's one of the leading thinkers and scholars in this field. He's written no less than 11 books on various aspects of civic education and civic life. He formerly was the director and I think creator of CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University. And he's been a valuable participant in numerous commissions, task forces, and other endeavors in this field. So I'm very pleased that Peter has agreed to moderate what I think you're all going to find to be a very, very interesting panel that is going to pick up some of the themes we've just been talking about, introduce others, and then give all of you additional time and a little more time to ask your questions and make your comments at the end of that panel discussion. Peter?
Thanks, Michael, so much for organizing this, and you and your colleagues. And it's been a really good day so far. I've learned a lot from that previous conversation. And I think the panel that I'm part of, which the rest of us are waiting on the wings, is very excited for the rest of the conversation and for possibly having some breakthroughs in thinking together about this issue, in which case you deserve credit for making it possible. Nice to see many friends too in the participant list and people I admire. The way it's going to work is I have 4 co-panelists. I'm going to talk to each one of them individually first to allow them to get some important points from their own work onto the table. And then we'll have a conversation among ourselves, and we'll have room for questions and from the audience. So keep those coming. I'm not going to introduce them all together, but let me just say it's a nicely chosen panel, and I can say that because I didn't choose them. It was Michael and his team, so I deserve no credit, but it is a nicely chosen panel, really diverse. I think in terms of philosophy and ideology, although people are not so easily classified, and some people, I think probably all 4 of them wouldn't want to be put in a box, but there's some perspectival differences, some philosophical differences, also expertise of all different kinds, academic and non-academic, experiential. We have several former classroom teachers in the mix, former college president, empirical researchers of different kinds. So coming from different angles. So I think you'll find it a rich conversation. And so I'm going to begin. So again, there'll be these kind of bilateral conversations, me and one person, and then we'll bring others in. So the first conversation is with my friend Diana Hess, who I'll introduce, and then I'll ask her a couple of questions. So Diana Hess is the Dean of the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is certainly one of America's great education schools by any standard. And she holds the Karen Falk Distinguished Chair of Education. She is an expert on many things. She knows a lot of things, but she's definitely an expert on this question of the role of controversial issue discussion in our schools, what causes it to happen and what the effects are and how to do it well. She's written 2 major books about it: Controversy in the Classroom, The Democratic Power of Discussion, and The Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education. The second was our mutual friend, Paula McAvoy. Both really cleaned up the prizes in a kind of amazing way. And by the way, also many spin-offs in terms of, those are fairly scholarly books, although they're very well written, but she's also written lots of teacher-friendly short pieces about how to do controversial issues in discussion in classrooms. Right now, she's leading, I don't know how she does it because she's also a dean, a multi-year empirical study called the Discussion Project, which is looking at professional development. Sorry, it's a study of the Discussion Project, which is professional development program for controversial issue discussion. And lastly, Diana was not born a dean. I remember when she was worried about whether she would get tenure, actually. So in previous lives was a high school teacher, a teachers union president, a curriculum writer, and then a foundation executive, making real change from that position. So Diana, it's always good to be talking to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Peter. It's great to be here.
So, I mean, the first question is about the core area of your expertise. Why? I mean, this is in some ways a summary of much of your work, but why is it important for students to be talking about controversial issues in their classrooms?
Well, I want to begin by saying it's really important for a functional democracy to have people who know how to engage in high quality discussions with other people who agree and disagree with them. I just can't imagine having a democracy without having people who know how to do that. And so then the question is, well, how do people learn how to do that? And I've always argued that people can learn how to engage in controversial issues discussions in a lot of different places, but schools are the best place. And I think there's 4 reasons for that. One is that schools are likely more diverse than the other venues that young people inhabit. And when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about a lot of dimensions of diversity, but one that is really important for controversial issues discussions is ideological diversity. And we have some evidence that indicates that schools are more ideologically diverse than the communities that schools are located in. And so diversity is just really important. You cannot have high quality controversial issues discussions without having a diverse array of opinions. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that schools have teachers who either already know how to teach young people how to engage in these discussions or could be taught how to do so. As you mentioned, Peter, I've spent a lot of my life working with professional development and working with teachers. And I'm just convinced that this is something that teachers can learn how to do. And in turn, they can teach their students how to engage in these high quality discussions. Schools also have courses that are good fits for controversial issues. A lot of those courses are in social studies. We've heard a lot of discussion about that in the last hour, which I also found really engaging and interesting to listen to. But it's not just social studies. In particular, science classes are great places for controversial issues discussions. And finally, we have a good body of research over many decades that indicates that when young people are taught how to engage in high quality discussions of controversial issues, they develop a lot of things that are aligned with what we need to have a functioning democracy. So in short, controversial issues discussions work as a form of civic education. I can also attest to the fact that when controversial issues discussions are really high quality, they're incredibly engaging to students. So we've heard a lot of complaints over the years about how boring schools are. And unfortunately, I think that's still the case in some cases, but I can tell you that after decades, literally, of watching controversial issues discussions in middle and high school classrooms, that they are really engaging, that students like those discussions and they find them interesting and they find them discussions in which they learn a lot. So in short, I think schools are just a great place for this work to happen.
Great, and I hope we have a chance to come back to some of those points later. But the other question I have for you is the controversy about controversy. So it feels to us who wrote the questions, but I think, it feels to me personally like the topic of controversial issue discussion in schools and also in colleges and universities has become a truly hot button topic itself in the last couple of years in a way that we didn't previously. So earlier, you probably struggled to get attention to the question of controversial issue discussion in social studies classrooms. And now it's a top 5 national issue. So what's going on with that? Why has if you agree that controversy has become controversial, why and what's it doing? Is that good or bad?
Well, I do agree that controversial issues discussions have become more controversial. I think one reason is just political polarization. As people become more hardened in their views and less likely to have experienced themselves engaging with discussions with people who have different political views. I think they find it difficult to have the appreciation they need for that. But that being said, I think we know from a lot of opinion polling recently that huge majorities of Americans think it's a good idea for both Americans to have different political viewpoints and to be able to talk with other people who have viewpoints that are different than their own. So I actually think that a lot of people think this is a good idea, but there's a lot of controversy about how it should happen in schools. That being said, just as we heard in the last panel, I think there are some people who've got a really big microphone who are trying to get in the way of high quality civics education. And I am really worried about that. I'm really worried about legislation that is shutting down discussions in classrooms. I'm really worried about some of the actions of some school board members. I think we really need to make the case to the public that schools should be doing this work, that they want schools to do this work if they want to have a functioning democracy. And I think we also have to prove that it can be done in a fair way. I don't believe in hiding things from parents. When I was a high school social studies teacher and I had a parent complain because she did not want her student to engage in an issue that we were talking about in class, I invited her in. I said, I want you to come in and sit and either participate if you would like, or watch what we're doing, because I want you to be comfortable in knowing that what I'm trying to do here is to not foist my own opinion on your child. What I'm trying to do here is to help your child learn how to build the skills to both understand controversial issues and talk with people who both agree with them and disagree with them.
Great. Well, I hope everybody's listening carefully because your job, whether you're a panelist or a member of the audience here, is to be thinking about questions and interjections either in the chat or the Q&A button, or if you're another panelist, you get an actual audio chance to push back on Diane or to ask your questions. But we're going to switch to our mutual friend, Joe Kahn. There he is. Hey, Joe. So this is Joe Kahn, the Ted and Joe Dutton Presidential Professor for Education Policy and Politics at University of California, Riverside, and also the co-director of the Civic Engagement Research Group, or I always call it SURGE, is that right? Yeah. At UC Riverside. So Joe's been working for a couple decades on civic education and related topics, and in just an incredibly prolific and rigorous and effective way. But to me, I think the thing, and so he has just an enormous number of influential studies and articles. To me, I think the most powerful thing all along has been Joe's ability to combine questions about theory and values, what we call in the academy normative questions, with empirical data in a way that really nobody else at all was doing when Joe started out, and that nobody's caught up with him on. So, I used to direct Circle, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which is more ably directed by Kay Kawashima Ginsburg nowadays. But when I directed it, we had about 6 or 7 people working there, and I once realized that Joe was producing about as much as we were on his own. So anyway, Joe, great to see you. And I actually want to ask you a couple of questions about recent studies. So in Joe's typical way, what he's doing is producing one study after another. So you had a recent study out published. You or somebody else could drop a link in the chat, but it was a national study of high school principals. And there are 2 interesting findings we wanted to hear from you a little more about. One is that, so you were able to look at, you had a large sample of high school principals, you were able to look at whether their districts were more conservative or liberal districts, and in terms of the people and the voting in the district. And you find that support for civic education is about the same in the liberal and conservative districts, not a divide there. But schools in conservative districts are less likely than those in liberal districts to provide support for discussion of controversial issues. So can you say a little more about that finding and what it means, what we should think about it?
Sure. So thank you, Peter, and great to be a part of this. Similarly, I've really enjoyed the conversation. As you said, I think one of our big questions for this whole event is, what can we do to shore up the foundations of democracy? And I think there's widespread recognition that the health of our democracy is going in the wrong direction. And there is simultaneously, and I think Diana was just speaking to this, pretty good evidence that there's a bunch of things schools can do, one of them being well-run controversial issue discussions. But there are other things schools can do too, related to things like service learning, related to leadership projects for young people, related obviously to just learning about history in very thoughtful and in-depth ways. There are lots of things schools can do that would help support the foundations of our democracy. And so I think a real question for us, right, is some of this political dysfunction that we're experiencing getting in the way of schools helping to respond to the political dysfunction we're experiencing, right? And so is there that kind of catch? And we did, as you said, a survey of principals, nationally representative, did this with John Rogers and Alex Quacco, both at UCLA. And what we found, I think in some ways was, it would make us feel a little better, and in some ways was concerning. So big picture, and I think this was consistent with the conversation between Rick and Pedro, the political context of the high school. So we geocoded all the high school districts. We looked at the voting patterns of the families that live in that district. Liberal districts and conservative districts, those principals in those districts worked in schools that were roughly equally supportive of democratic education. When you look at most of the practices we associate with high quality democratic education, service learning, engagement of young people in leadership opportunities, even in education related to the upcoming election. And I should say this research was conducted just prior to the 2018 midterms, which were perhaps not as contentious as where we are right now, but they were pretty contentious times. And we found that whether it was liberal or conservative district, those schools were equally supportive of educating young people about the elections. The big difference we found was in relation to what Diana was talking about, controversial issue discussion. Conservative districts were 20% less likely to support professional development related to controversial issue discussion as were more liberal districts. And I'll throw out one other finding that I think is really key here in terms of how do we get ourselves, on a firmer footing as educators. The other thing that really mattered was leadership. When principals were committed to civic engagement, as reflected in the fact that they themselves were civically engaged outside of the school, and when the district had policies and practices that emphasized civic engagement, when, for example, they did sessions where they talked with principals about the importance of civic engagement, those things dramatically increased the amount of support for civic engagement going on in the high schools. So it's not a huge surprise in a certain sense, but I think it is really important that if we want to emphasize civic education, paying attention to leaders is key, and that can work in both conservative and liberal contexts.
So, that's helpful. I was hoping that last sentence is important because I was looking for solutions. So we can talk more about that later. Another thing that you are very well known for studying for a long time is young people's use of digital media, new media, social media, starting even before I think Facebook existed. And you've had some recent research on that topic. What about polarization there? I mean, do you think that there's an agreement across the political spectrum that kids need to learn to use digital media well, or is polarization getting in the way of that objective?
It's a great question. and I think, Rick in the earlier comments, talked about just how challenging many of the dynamics that occur through social media can be for democratic society. And let's be clear, this is not just a problem for young people. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that adults are more engaged in the circulation of blatant falsehoods than are young people. And frequently adults are doing it knowing that what they're circulating is not accurate and deciding to do it anyway. So I think we have to just be careful in that respect. This is not we talk about young people being on social media, and they are. This isn't a kid's problem. This is a everybody problem. I think the data is pretty good here. When schools talk with kids about, well, let me back up for a second. I think there are three different domains we need to distinguish between. One is a kind of safety and civility domain, right? There's a lot of bullying that goes on in schools. One is a kind of information analysis domain. And one is what we might think of as a voice and civic engagement domain. In other words, young people aren't just consuming information, they're also producing and sharing it. And this is a framework that I worked out, that we've published with colleagues through a project that I know you were involved with too in the National Academy of Education. And the answers, I think, in all cases, is schools can help. Good evidence that schools' bullying programs on social media can help. Good evidence that you can teach kids to be better at judging the credibility of information, and good evidence that you can improve the quality of what young people produce and share if you talk about it with them in school. So while kids are active, schools can help. With Daniela DiGiacomo and Erica Hodgin, Samia Alcom, and Caitlin Taylor, we just did a study looking at the bills that have passed related to digital media literacy in the 50 states. So you were asking, is this something that is cross-partisan? I think the degree to which it's cross-partisan is mostly that no states are doing very much.
Right.
So of the 50 states, and this is data from spring of 2021, 11 different states had passed legislation to support media literacy. So 80% of states roughly aren't doing anything. So in that sense, it's bipartisan. There is a slight partisan lean where Democratic states are a little more active of those 11 states that are doing things. But I don't think that's something to be proud of. What really we need to do is get all states to be doing something more substantive. And of the things they're doing, they're leaning heavily into safety and civility and information and credibility, where I think are important goals. But they're not spending as much time doing the things that would give youth voice and agency, and frequently things that would be very much worth investing.
Right. I mean, bad, but good summary. And we'll put that together in some ways with what Diana said, because she talked about how controversial issue discussion works, but we don't invest enough in it. And you said digital media literacy works, or digital media education works, and we don't invest that much in it.
And these bills, I think only 5 of the bills that passed included any money for professional development for teachers.
Right.
So, to the extent that we're doing stuff we're not willing to take.
Great, thank you. Thanks. So we'll see you again in a couple minutes. I feel like I have a waiting room here or something.
Awesome.
And next coming into it is Denora Itocho, who is a public interest lawyer and a very active one, a policy advocate, an executive of nonprofits, including right now, Do Something. I'll come back to that in a second. She's a native New Yorker. She has an incredible resume, actually, of service and advocacy in the city of New York in all the different sectors, really, from sitting on a Manhattan community board in the up Community Board 7 in Upper West Side, to working for the New York City Council as a legislative attorney, but also all kinds of civil society and nonprofit roles and boards. She's a prolific writer. She's contributed to the Des Moines Register, Gotham Gazette, Huffington Post, New York Times City Blog, Newsday. She's on podcasts and other kinds of digital media. And of course, involved in civic education, or she wouldn't be in this panel. So in a couple of ways, I mean, Previously, she was executive director of Generation Citizen for New York. Folks probably know Generation Citizen, but not everybody does, and you'll have a chance to talk about it a little bit. So that's a major, fairly young, but very robust civic education provider, and Denora was running the New York version, and is now chief executive officer of DoSomething.org, which is much older, 28 years old, nonprofit that advocates for young people, that activates young people for social impact. And she notes prominently in her bio that she's also a mother of 3, which is another kind of civic education, I'm sure. So Denora, thanks so much for joining this conversation. This is going to be great. And with a couple of questions for you. The first one is, it kind of follows on the previous, because Diana got to talk about controversial issue discussion. Joe got to talk partly about digital literacy. Another recommended thing is students being active, doing stuff. That's another recommended pedagogy. And I just wanted to hear you, because you've championed that in 2 jobs in a row now, talk about why that matters. Why should kids do something? Why should kids do something?
Why should kids do something? Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and for that very generous introduction. It's a great and timely discussion for us to engage in today. And it was great to hear all of the other panelists really lay the foundation for this specific question. You know, throughout my career, but especially most recently at Generation Citizen, where, like you said, I led their New York operations, and really thought about what does it mean to have experiential civics education, and to take it from going, you know, this kind of household name of civics education feeling outdated, antiquated, and old, but really making it relevant to young people and what they need to learn in a 21st century environment, right? I think for so many of us, myself included, I came of age at a time where just having that civic knowledge, memorizing the data and the information you need to know about how a bill becomes a law, or kind of schoolhouse rock, if you will, was the way we learned and the way we understood how government works. But when you think about the moment we're in now, when we're in this critical inflection point, while we navigate an intersectional reckoning, as I call it, amidst this enduring pandemic, we also realize that young people are squarely in the digital age. So the notion of just memorizing the kind of core civic knowledge that young people need is not going to motivate young people to be engaged and effective citizens. And if that's what we're driving towards, then having civic skills, making sure that young people are getting the hands-on opportunities to be able to learn and practice, right, kind of learn while doing, is critically important, right? So I think about, when you think about education and its ability to be an equalizer in addressing economic, social, and political inequality and inequity, if students are not all getting a chance to practice democracy, then some young people are not going to think democracy is a proposition that is for them. But our governing documents tell us that it's about us, we the people. But not all young people see themselves in the fabric of that democracy. And so being able to actually have a common set of social and civic values, but also then being able to practice those is what's going to make it real and tangible for young people, giving them the chance to understand that, yes, we need to know how a bill becomes a law, if you will, but we also need to understand, what does it mean for me to be able to practice being a citizen? And so really integrating that into education in a comprehensive and consistent manner is going to be key to the success for young people in their academic settings, but also as they become adults and practice those civic skills and those 21st century skills in the real world.
Great, thank you. That was eloquent. So the other main question for you is the phrase action civics. Now, Generation Citizen was one of the founders of that phrase. I was actually at the meeting, believe it or not. You know, it was a way to rebrand some kinds of pedagogy, really, to call it action civics. It's become super controversial, so that it's a key talking point of rejecting what's going on in civics today, basically from the right. I mean, that's the fact. It is from the right. So, what's your reaction to that? I mean, I guess why do you think that happened, and or what's your response if somebody criticizes action civics?
You know, it's a great question, right? Because I think the negative reaction is exactly what you said. It's about polarization, and it's about a lack of understanding about what we're actually describing. So I think about it, you know, in my current role, where a lot of the work that we do to engage young people to take action on issues they care about is really getting them to have a sense of community and a collective that gets them motivated. When you think about the root cause, if you will, of why action civics feels polarizing, it's because we are making it clear that the participation in democracy has to be active, right? You know, I jokingly or not jokingly say that democracy is a full contact sport, but if we are not all actively engaged in it, then it can't function and thrive. And so to me, I want to debunk that, right? This is not a marketing issue. This is about understanding what we're describing when we talk about experiential learning. So let's talk about what that is, right? If students are growing up in a 21st century democracy, squarely in this digital information age, again, they're not going to just want to learn and, you know, memorize the facts that they can Google. They want to actually practice those skills. And so when you look at a state like New York, for example, that recently adopted a seal of civic readiness as a graduation standard, they were talking about key skill development that all young people would want to need to achieve in order to be effective and engaged citizens. So when I hear someone say, oh, action civics is a problem, I would counter and say, is it truly a problem for young people to examine issues that impact their community and understand how it relates to them? Is it a problem for them to identify that issue and dig in more deeply, right? If we're talking about the pedagogy behind action civics, or to conduct research into an issue or understand and analyze that research? Is it a problem for young people to develop strategies and solutions to address the root cause of an issue and then take informed action, or to communicate about what they learn or reflect on how they can take what they've learned and adapt it for another instance? If we describe what we're describing, you know, if we actually unpack action civics and break it down to its component parts, no one should be against that, right? Because those are skills, 21st century skills that each one of us are using in our professional settings every day. Why would we not want young people to gain those skills in a school setting and understand how it relates to our fundamental governing democracy, right? And so I think it's like we have to actually debunk the argument. It's not about you know, zinging, you know, messaging or marketing tricks. It's about the, you know, the pedagogy that underlying that, and how do we make it clear that what we all are talking about are skills that all of us, even as adults, want to make sure we achieve and acquire and practice every day. And so for me, the first thing I'm going to say is let's actually talk about what we're describing here, as opposed to using buzzwords to further polarize us at this critical moment.
Great, thank you. Lots to think about, and I hope everybody's thinking actively and critically as you speak. And we'll have you back on camera in a couple minutes. But I'm going to now welcome David Davenport. So here he is. Nope.
There
Yes.
it is.
There he is with his bobbleheads behind him. So David Davenport is a research center at the Hoover Institution, which is associated with Stanford University, and a senior fellow at the Ashbrook Center. He was president of Pepperdine University from 1985 to 2000 and did many things there, and the university thrived. But among other things, founded Common Sense California and the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership, both of which, David, I've actually had the opportunity to work with, and they're important institutions. He's the author of 4 books about American policy and politics, I would say not narrowly about civic education, but is currently co-authoring a book on what he calls the civic education crisis, and published a study in 2020 for the Hatch Center entitled Common Sense Solutions to Our Civics Crisis. And David Davenport is a regular columnist for Forbes Online and for the Washington Examiner, and generally a public intellectual. And we are glad to have you with us. I wanted to start. So the first hour, there was much discussion of this legislation, and well, some interesting consensus actually on some of the legislation, but some disagreements too. Wanted to get your take on it. So a bunch of states are passing legislation. Actually, I should say states passed legislation on civics for all different purposes, including new course requirements and new tests. And there's a lot of legislation if we really wanted to just describe the legislation. But I think our question for you is more legislation that's got a conservative, at least the core support for it is conservative, and it's seen as critical of of what's happening in classrooms. I just wanted to get your take on that wave of legislation, what you think of it, and why you think we're seeing it.
Well, I'm not a big fan of it, but which I'll explain in a moment. But I do think that it might help to understand why it's come about. Right. My own reading of this is that a number of ideas have come out of the academy, primarily thought kind of leaders, journalists, scholars that have sought to change the way we teach American history and civics. I mean, you can date it maybe to Howard Zinn, if not earlier, in his 1980 book, A People's History of the United States, and it's right on through the 1619 Project. So a lot of the ideas that I think have troubled conservatives have really come out of the academy, out of scholarship, out of journalism and the like. And frankly, I think we all recognize that that's not the strength of conservatives. Conservatives are not as strong in the academy. But where are they strong? Well, they're strong, frankly, in state and local governments. And so my own reading of it is that they have pushed back there because that's where they have political strength and political power. And so in school boards, where you will find more conservative influence, in state legislatures the same, you'll see them then fighting back, saying, no, we're not going to see our state money spent. We're not going to see our educational policies devoted to this kind of teaching. So that's my view on kind of how we got here. I'm not a fan of it. In fact, one quick analogy I use even with conservative friends is, these bills strike me as like the old arcade game. I also have kids, although a little older, whack-a-mole, where the mole pops up and you're supposed to try to whack them all down. You're never going to whack down every bad idea in education. And it's sort of like in a garden. You not only need to be abating weeds, but you need to be planting good, strong seeds. And so to me, part of the key would be, even for conservatives, to recognize that stopping bad ideas is not itself the most useful aspect of developing the civic education garden, if you will, that planning more robust civic education, having students who can resist and discern bad ideas is more valuable than trying to cut out all the weeds. So I'm not a huge fan of it. I also, last thing I'll say on it is, I don't really think that's the job of state legislators. I mean, they're not educational experts. And so for them to be whacking this or that educational theory has them playing the wrong role in the process. So it troubles me by and large, but as I said, I think I understand kind of how we got here and where they're coming from.
No, that's helpful and very insightful. And it's kind of your last point is kind of a segue to answering the second question, which is about solutions. But you have some ideas about how we might find common ground on policies for better civics. And so can you tell us about that?
I do have several ideas, but I think I'm going to focus primarily on one. My role is really not to be a political conservative in this field. I'd like to think I'm an educator first and foremost, and my work at the Hoover Institution is policy related. So I come from an educator policy point of view. And yes, I think it is very interesting and important how we teach civics and history. And so I have a lot of ideas about that. But I think more likely we could find common ground as educators and policy people if we thought and talked and worked more on having more civic education than putting all of our time and energy into the more heavily conflicted area of what civic education and history do we teach and how do we go about it? Because I think we clearly have problems on both sides of that ledger. I think the first problem is we're just not teaching enough civic education anymore. I mean, when you go back to the 50s, 60s, and maybe even into the 70s, students began getting civics I had civics in the primary grades. And we just continued to add civics right on up until the high school courses. Well, now it's a bit of a rarity that you find much civics being done in elementary and secondary schools. And so by the time you get to the one semester class in high school, which is all that's left in a lot of states, the students don't have a proper context for it. They haven't built a base. They don't have the vocabulary. They don't know what the issues are. And so it's almost kind of too little too late, I think, to come to a one semester course in civics. So what I'm really wondering is if we couldn't get around the idea of more civics, as opposed to all of our emphasis on what kind and how. Many of us have seen this figure, which I think is accurate, that the federal government, for example, spends $54 a year per student on STEM, for example, and 5 cents on civics. So I think that first, No Child Left Behind, heavy testing and reading and math, and now STEM education are movements that have sort of pushed social studies broadly and certainly civics into the shadows, if you will, of education. And so I think one of the things that maybe we could rally around is having more civics. And maybe combined with that is sort of a federalism idea that we allow the proper levels of players play their proper role. So it's not the role of the federal government to tell us whether to teach action civics or not. And it's not the role of state governments to tell us whether we can teach slavery or not, and so forth. It's the role of the federal government, frankly, to be cheerleaders and perhaps funders. It's the role of the states to decide primarily how much history and civics are we going to require in the curriculum. And then it comes to school boards, schools, and teachers to decide how and what. And I have a lot of views on that as well. But last thing I'll say on this, I'm sorry I've gone on a little long, but just a quick thought. I think even we maybe are falling into a little bit of the controversial trap ourselves when we say that democracy is broken and we need to use civics to fix democracy. I don't necessarily disagree with the premise. Democracy has very serious problems that need to be addressed. But if we lay that onto our kids' civic education, then I think we get mired further in controversy. You know, what? So again, I'm trying to just, as an educator, say, we need to go back to building civics from kindergarten right on through, building my dad was a baker, building the layer cake, not waiting for a one semester course in high school. We need to be refunding more and requiring more. And then I think letting the people more directly involved make some of the decisions about exactly what and how.
Great, good. So that's in a way, that's an idea that's on the table. It's certainly not the only one that this group needs to come, needs to endorse, but it's on the table for discussion. And so I'd love it if Dinora and Diana and Joe would join us, and we'll begin with this kind of proposal, which is David's, which is more civics but federalism. So we say a little bit, we don't expect to reach consensus on either the content or the pedagogy in great detail, but we agree about the importance of it, and we just put more money and time into it. And I think that'll be at least a starting point for debate and discussion. So anybody have a reaction to that?
Well, I'll start. I totally agree that we need more civic education in schools, and I love the layer cake analogy. I mean, I think we need really high quality civic education in elementary school and middle school and high school. Having a one semester high school course is clearly not enough. So I totally agree with that. I'm not sure about how much civic education was taught in the past. You know, there's some debate about that among scholars, but to David, use your point about planting seeds and not abating weeds, I would rather just agree to disagree about how much civic education we had in the past, but agree that we need more going forward. And I also agree with how you describe federalism, with the caveat that I think you alluded to, that the federal government has got to fund civic education. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so supportive of the Educating for Democracy Act is that it will provide lots of funding for high quality professional development and the development of new materials. And I think it's going to be virtually impossible to ensure that all teachers who are teaching civic education have the skills they need to do so without the federal government being involved. So I am very much a fan of that. And I think we've had times in our past, not that long ago, when the federal government was putting more money into civic education and a lot of money into law-related education, which was part of civic education. And that enabled the development of a national network that disseminated high-quality professional learning in virtually every state in the United States. So we know how to do this. This is not something that we have to create from scratch.
Dinora and/or Joe, no pressure, but this is a space for you to jump in if you'd like on this idea.
I'll jump in quick just to say I think there's a lot to be said, David, for what you're laying out in terms of the realities of what different levels of government can do well, and the huge need for greater infrastructure to support civic ed. So I like that a lot. I also think it allows us to have some of the more challenging conversations at a more local level, where I think they can be managed perhaps a bit better, because these issues are going to be handled better in different contexts. And I think while that definitely means the civic ed that goes on in some communities will be further or closer to my personal ideal, I think that is a healthy way to think about at least one part of our strategy for moving forward.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I wanted to ask about, because this pushes, this is where the rubber hits the road. So if we have a very strongly decentralized system, and we say that it's up to districts and even teachers to figure out what to teach, then you're going to get a big range, and it's going to go all the way to extremes. So how are you with that? So are you, and whose business is it? So if
right. I mean, I think, just to quickly qualify, I think you're exactly right. It's not that there should be nothing there to try to protect or constrain or shape so that we avoid some very problematic things that no doubt still will happen, right? We have 60 million children in school on a given day. Strange stuff is going to happen in some of those classrooms, but we can do better to protect. But there's a big space between having guidelines like, we need to teach the full history of the United States, and trying to intricately shape exactly how kids talk or how teachers teach about some of the most controversial issues of the day.
Denora, it looked like you wanted to get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into this part of the conversation, because I agree. I think we all agree more civics is necessary. And I really appreciate Diana's framing of like, let's not litigate the past and let's really talk about what's necessary now. My concern with the lack of standards is if we are asking teachers already to play such a big role in the nurturing and education of young people, and without some level of standardization, one, as has already been said, we're going to increase the risk that we're going to go to extremes. But two, we're also going to really drive towards more inequity in the system. So if I'm a kid from the South Bronx and I learned one version of history because that's what my teacher felt equipped to teach me, but someone else in another district, had a teacher who took more initiative or got more professional development and training, taught me something different. How does that decrease the polarization and help us have a more healthy and functioning democracy? So on some level, I just want to push us to think that we do need some level of standardization, because without it, that's why we're in the moment we're in now, right? And we can all create our own versions of history, and our democracy and our young people are suffering because of it.
In a minute, I want to see if David wants to respond to this conversation, because his proposal on the table, and it's getting support, but also some caveats. I mean, the other thing that occurs to me is that it is a national market. So, in the NAEP, 74, the National Assessment of Education Progress data, 74% of eighth graders say that they read from the textbook every day. No, that read for the textbook every week, and 34% say they read every day in the social studies classroom. So you have, and it's not just the textbook publishers, but it's also the big nonprofits. 1 million students played iCivics Race to the White House. These are my friends, but both iCivics and the textbook publishers. I'm not criticizing anybody, but I'm just saying it is actually a national market. There's a lot of actual homogeneity. And I think I guess just to put my own view on the table, David, and I'm curious what you think, I just worry that if we say federalism and everybody can do it the way they want, we've actually just said we're not going to say anything about the kind of what is actually a national market. So we're not going to have then opinions about what should be in the textbooks or what iCivic should do or these other kinds of large scale actors.
Well, just a small point. I mean, we all know that we have a lot of variety in textbooks, for example. That's not a national market, really. I mean, the Texas version of civics and history textbook, it has the same title and author on the front, but it's not the same book as we have in California. So, and I'm not defending that. I mean, that's in an ideal world, I wouldn't like to have that, but it does exist. And yes, I think that's a risk of allowing somebody else other than, say, the federal government to make some of those decisions. I would just say, there will still, Peter, you said you had some concern whether, these voices would be heard or something would be said. there's going to be a lot of voices urging for the very things that the panel is concerned about. I'm just saying, I'm not sure that voice should be a vote in the United States Senate or even a vote in the Georgia Senate. I'm not sure they're the ones that ought to be saying it, but I think there will still be plenty of voices saying it. And I think then, as I say, I think it's largely left to school boards or even state school boards if necessary, or, I mean, experts in education, not legislators, not politicians. I don't think we help ourselves there.
I think it certainly analytically it's useful to differentiate between a kind of a national discussion on one hand and federal policy on the other. You can have a national discussion at some point.
Absolutely.
And federal policy seems like not even very plausible to me, not to mention. I did want to say, I thought when the New York Times did this story about how the textbooks varied by state, and it was presented a little bit as an expose, as if we were supposed to be very upset about it. I had a different reaction. One was I thought the textbooks were remarkably similar because they highlighted differences, but a very high proportion of the textbooks was the same. And the second was, if you are a Federalist, you in the traditional sense, you would expect Texas and California's textbook to look a little different. And so a 10% difference didn't seem to me like some kind of scandal. It seemed to me like flexibility. There were parts of, well, to be honest, there were parts of the Texas textbook I didn't like at all. But that's the price, right? But I'm sitting in Cambridge, Mass, liberal college professor, but I actually would object to them, and I think I could argue that they were bad. But that's the price you pay for federalism, right? Right.
And I would probably agree with you on both counts.
Yeah, you might. Yeah, I think you might. Yeah, because I don't think they were consistent with sound conservative thought either. Yeah.
For the sake of being provocative, I'd like to speak against local control of the curriculum.
Great.
So some of you might have seen today, there's been a lot of attention to a story out of Texas where a superintendent directed librarians in the school district to get a number of books out of the library. And he said specifically that he noted that members of the school board, his bosses, were also very conservative. And to school employees who might have different political beliefs, the superintendent said, you better hide it. Here in this community, we're going to be conservative. That really concerns me. I think it concerns a number of lawyers in Texas as well, who I imagine are quite busy today. But what I worry about is that if we don't have some at least state standards for what constitutes high quality civic education, we're going to have too much variance. And we're also putting responsibility on school boards that they shouldn't be expected to take. So here in Wisconsin, and not a big state, we have 400 school districts. I don't want every one of those school districts, some of them that only have 3 schools, to have to create their own civic standards. I would much rather have our state Department of Instruction that has experts who work on developing standards and curriculum do that work. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be some variance from local community to local community, but it really worries me when I hear people say, well, let's have local school districts do everything. Let's think about that for a moment in terms of algebra. Are we really saying to all of these school districts all across America, we know that you have your own way of teaching algebra, so, write your own algebra curriculum? I think it's absurd on its face. We know enough about what constitutes high quality civic education to come up with robust state standards that don't tie teachers' hands. There's always going to be local variation, but also don't say to everyone and their brother in all these school districts, it's your responsibility to develop how we're going to approach civic education. I just think it's both unfair and it's going to lead to bad things, including really low quality civic education.
What do you all think about the role of standards? Just generally, do they matter at all? Are they helpful?
I'm not sure what you mean by standards. I favor, and a number of states are moving in this direction, that the state policy, and certainly I meant to say, Diana, that I think state school boards have a big role to play in all this, not just local school boards. I think that the notion of states coming along and saying in kindergarten, we think these subjects could and should be addressed. In first grade, second grade, these are age appropriate civics topics that should be addressed. To me, that would be very helpful because it begins to build the layer cake. And I think that it has some agreed upon guidance as to, you know, what subjects we're going to be getting into. By standards, do you mean something more specific than that?
I was thinking of the state standards documents, a little more inside baseball kind of question about their role in promoting civic education. Just wondering if nobody's rising to the bait on that one. We can shift. So I was asked to ask you whether could people across the political spectrum agree on the value of diversity as a principle, on how this value can be brought into the classroom. But I kind of want to broaden it to other big values that might come up. So there would also be patriotism, reflective patriotism, diversity. There's equity, there's inclusion. So let me restate the question as, what do you think are some of the big abstract nouns, the big ideals that you think we could get agreement about that also matter to you personally?
Well, I'll start. I think we can get agreement on the fact that we should have more civics. And I think we can get agreement on much of what Denora was talking about in terms of civics needs to be active. I mean, I think people who remember low quality civics where they were expected to memorize a whole, litany of things, I don't think anyone looks back on those days fondly and says, well, that was really great. I mean, I think that really high quality active civics is really important. And I think there's a lot of ways of doing that in a lot of different communities that people, regardless of their political ideology, would support. I've seen it. So I don't think that this is something that's necessarily polarizing. And so I think we need to take back the phrase action civics and say, this is not something that should be divisive, but this is something that is analogous to saying high quality civics.
So if we were a committee, we would have David's proposal to do more civics, and then we'd have a proposed friendly amendment to make sure it's experiential so that it's not boring. So non-boring, more.
I mean,
yeah.
Let me just respond briefly. First of all, I think there are ways to do classroom teaching of civics that are not boring. So I kind of resist the notion that the trade-off is between classroom boring and action not boring. I'm a big proponent, and I've been very active in training teachers in the use of primary documents for the teaching of history and civics. And those are not boring. They're recreating for students the controversies and the debates and the speeches of the day when they're studying American history. And I think to lead students into questions of the why of civics, not just the nuts and bolts of how does this or that work, but why do we do things this way? Why was this policy, or why do we have federalism? Why do we have separations of powers? What was its purpose then? Is it still serving that purpose now? If not, what else might serve its purpose better? So I think if we let students get into some of the, in addition to the primary documents, if we would have civics get more into questions of why, and allow students to draw their own conclusions about them, not have them, loaded by the textbook or whatever. I certainly favor that. And then I think, to me, action civics very much, and I'm not using the phrase politically, engaging in action in civics is not itself harmful. The only problem that I would have is if it becomes the primary way of teaching history and civics. To me, it's sort of a cart and a horse thing. First, the horse is that we need to have enough knowledge to appreciate what we're doing in the action. I sometimes analogize to scientific experiments. You don't just run around the world, doing experiments. You first learn in the classroom, you form a hypothesis, you go out into the world and test it, you come back into the classroom and evaluate what you learned and how that affects your hypothesis. Action in that way, I think, is clearly a good thing. I mean, just as it would be in science class. So I guess I agree with Denora that we've allowed a term to be politicized that is really not, I mean, the politicization of that term is not appropriate. We need to be educators about it, not politicians about it. So I think it has its place, but I don't think it should be the primary way we teach history and civics.
Denora, I saw you nodding, but I'm curious about your feeling about the relationship between action and sort of what you could call classroom learning.
Well, I think I don't think so. If we're like taking the takeaways here, right? We all agree we want more civics. I think we would all agree we want young people to gain that civic knowledge, right? So the understanding of our foundational documents and how our democracy was founded has to be a part of the learning. And if we can get that knowledge and skills, that we are then allowing young people to develop the right civic dispositions or mindsets, they're going to make them, back to your question, patriotic, civic-minded, effective citizens, right? I think we can get to some of those shared values. I think some of the other ones might be a bridge too far in this moment, but we have, if we're getting, the right civic knowledge and skill development at the outset, I think it allows a certain level of standards that all young people will have. They'll leave their, K-12 experience with that same foundation laid that then can lead to what is patriotism? What does it mean to be a part of this democracy? But now, because it's so inconsistent and there are not standards, generally applicable throughout the states, I think that's where the confusion comes in. That's why there's more polarization. And so to me, I think it would be helpful then to have more consistency applied to get that civic knowledge. I 100% agree, to start to practice those civic skills, but then that allows the behavioral shifts and mindset shifts that can lead to what you suggested, are we patriots? Are we a part of this same, democracy, or this we the people, if you will?
That's
I want
great.
to distinguish, I want to go back to what David said, because I really appreciated his framing of this. I'm not suggesting that classroom civic education is boring. I've been in hundreds of classrooms all over the country and watched really exciting classroom civic education. And I'd like to believe that when I was teaching high school social studies in Downers Grove, Illinois, my classroom was a pretty exciting place. And I also think you can do action civics within the confines of the classroom. I don't think you have to be outside of the classroom walls to do really high quality action civics. I think we know a lot from recent research about how high quality simulations are actually a form of what we would consider action civics. I think action civics can also include doing things in the community, doing things outside of the classroom. But I don't think we should have these fake dichotomies that one thing is boring and the other thing is by definition exciting. When I used to assign my high school civic students to go to county board meetings, I can tell you, unless they just happened to stumble on something that was really scintillating, they usually came back and said, wow, that was not the most interesting 2 hours I've ever spent. So just because we're outside of the classroom doesn't mean by definition that we're in excitement land.
Yeah, I would just say that in my view, you guys are starting to soften me a little on standards. I have to admit, I would have come into this conversation saying, and therefore I'd like to put it out there as sort of a test, that in addition, my top two priorities to improve civics would be, number one, more civics, as I've already said, but number two would be far more and better teacher training. And so some of the things that you guys are wanting to accomplish through standards, I would have thought is probably best accomplished through teacher training, but I'm sure both are needed in some degree or another. As I said, I've been involved in training teachers to teach using primary documents. And I think through the Ashbrook Center, we've trained 25,000 of them or something. I mean, it's a revolutionary sort of thing in their teaching and in the engagement and in test scores of students and that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that's the only way to get better classroom teaching, but I'm just saying I have done a little research on the uneven teacher preparation for civics, and it's much higher than in many other subjects. Both the training they had before they got in the classroom and the certification standards of the states are extremely uneven. And therefore, it's sort of left to a lot of these nonprofit groups to be offering in-service training, if you will. And maybe that's all we have for now. So anyway,
but the scale of
I
that
would
is
want
really
to accomplish
small.
some of what you're talking about also through teacher training is my point, which I think is
Everybody
great.
agree. Everybody's nodding. Just want to. So now we've come up with I think I could argue against this if we had more time and if you would let me, but we don't have time, so it can't. So I think we've come up with a consensus here that we want more civics. It needs to be good, and that means engaging. The engagement is both in and outside of the classroom, and to get there, we're going to need a lot more professional development and less. While the nonprofits that provide it do a great job, they really don't reach that many teachers. Well, that's good. So I think the title for this whole session was, "Can we reach common ground?" And we did it. So I feel like I want to puncture that. But actually, what we're going to do now, you're all still on the hook. Don't go away. Everybody who's listening should be thinking of questions, which can also be challenges or critiques. Put them in the Q&A. But meanwhile, we're going to hear from two prepared questions in video form. I haven't seen them myself. I don't know what they say. One is from a teacher and one is from a student. So let's see what they say. I think, Lila, we'll show them.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Watson. I am from Paterson, New Jersey, and I am one of the graduate vocal instructors at Teachers College, Columbia University. I am also a K-12 music teacher here in the city in the Paterson Public School System. My question is, some have said that classroom conversations on controversial issues should deal solely with historical or scientific issues and steer clear of current political issues. Do you agree? If not, how should teachers and other members of school communities navigate discussion of current political topics in the classroom?
So everybody's welcome to address this, but I have to call on Diana first because you made a very clear point in both of your books of talking about current. It's sort of, I think it's, unless I'm misremembering, I think it's sort of definitional of what you're calling for. So do you want to say something about why current, and then others can weigh in?
Yeah, let me say it very quickly. I believe that young people need to be taught how to talk about current, authentic, controversial issues. It's not the only thing that they need to be taught. I think they should be talking about historical issues. I think they should be talking about scientific issues, which, by the way, are often current controversial issues. But I think if we don't engage students in talking about the actual questions that are before us now, we're really making a mistake. I think those discussions are really, engaging. I think those discussions are really important if what we're trying to do is to make sure that young people can actually be active participants on the political stage. They literally have to learn about these issues.
I would put Peter, I would put a word of caution about current issues in the teaching of history as opposed to civics. And I think I say that because I think it's a bit of a disease we have about history in general, that is only worth studying because of how it applies to today. And so I would just say I wouldn't ban it, certainly. I mean, I think that would be silly. But I don't think you just study the Great Depression to understand how to manage the economy today. I don't think that's the only purpose and value of that. So to me, it would be the last question I would ask in a segment on the Great Depression, and I would spend 10 or 20% of my time on it, not 80%, because I think history has other values than just today's controversy. On the other hand, I would be more robust in allowing it in government and civics, because they're wrestling with those questions today, and students are aware of that.
Well, I was going to say, I would weigh in to say, to the point earlier made about media literacy, right? It's relevant for young people to also be able to process and digest what they're experiencing in real time, right? I'm both a fan of technology, but also it has its limitations. Insofar as for young people, they've been able to create these echo chambers where, without the right baseline knowledge and understanding of the history or the present, they have, decided fact and reality. And I think that's doing more harm to our democracy and our society than good. And so I do think, right, let's not burden teachers with more responsibility without support. So we can all agree, again, this is a place where educators need professional development and support to facilitate those conversations in ways that are productive, but are also helping young people continue to be in this laboratory environment where they're learning, right? So school shouldn't be the place where you just consume information without actually having an opportunity to test out what you're learning. And so let's support teachers in being able to have those conversations, but they definitely should be having them in real time.
So
One of my
Well, just to agree, you had asked about some, what are some places that we think we could actually not just get an agreement on this among this group, but in the broader public. I think there is the potential for broad public support for the idea that kids talk about the things that are going on in the world. In other words, I do think that is something, and kids understand it is interesting, teachers get its relevance. And this gets back to sort of what are the broad points of agreement, though, we need around the structuring of those experiences. I think you lose that agreement very quickly if people feel it's not an open classroom climate in which it is possible for people to express divergent opinions, which doesn't mean we routinely deliver that climate, but I think that when people feel it isn't that, you get an understandable pushback, especially in public schools that people are mandated to go to, right? The other thing that becomes super important that I think Denora is talking about is schools are uniquely positioned to make sure those conversations are informed. They should be informed both by what we might think of as expert knowledge, but they also should be informed by people's lived experiences. And it's important not just for kids to be able to talk about their own lived experiences, but to hear about the lived experiences of others. And so if we just have a couple of these kinds of structures around, we want there to be evidence brought into it, we want there to be space for knowledge and expertise, which includes the knowledge of the young people themselves. We want it to be open, where people can have divergent opinions. I think you could get a lot of what we're looking for in terms of a high quality civic experience.
And I hope you're right. I think we're going to move to, we've got now a whole bank of really good questions. So I'm going to move us to listening to another question from, I think, a student.
Hello, my name is Martine, and I'm a senior in the Syracuse City School District here in upstate New York. My question is based on an inter-school dialogue program that I'm part of. So through this program, I've become aware how topics such as redlining are taught differently in my city school versus a suburban school 15 minutes away. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, what you have to say, and if you think that this is appropriate.
I just have to say I am a graduate of the Syracuse Public Schools, kindergarten to 12th grade. So I'm glad to see those. I wonder what high school she goes to. But what do you all think? So what she's noticed is a big difference in the way a particular topic, which is redlining, which is a very serious issue in Syracuse, New York, is taught in the city versus in the suburbs. City majority people of color, in the suburbs much less so. So any thoughts about either what do you think of that, but also what you might do about it?
So I don't at all want to diminish the importance of what she's talking about in the way that I respond to this. To some extent, that's what you're going to get in the world. I'm not saying that's good. I think schools are better positioned than most institutions, and teachers are potentially more oriented than, say, parents, to make sure that kids hear other perspectives. So we have to lean hard into that so that that gap between your geography and the points of view that you hear is diminished. So I think the issue she's raising is huge. I don't think, some of it is going to happen because contexts matter and people are biased and all of that stuff plays out. So we really have to help schools tap what I think they are better positioned to do than many other institutions, which is make sure that kids get a fuller picture of the world.
I'd also like to say that, it's really important that all students learn about redlining. So this gets back to both high quality standards, high quality curriculum, high quality professional learning. I think it would be a real problem if we had millions of students coming out of, many years of public education without ever hearing about redlining. But I want to get to a different point about what she said. I'm impressed she was part of an inter-school dialogue. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, we are often struggling with in civic education is how to expose students to students who are different than they are. And one of the time-honored ways of doing this, back to Girls State and Boys State and Model UN and the Choices program and, all sorts of programs that have been for the most part, funded, a lot of them by federal money, is to get students in serious conversation with one another about important issues. And in part of the political classroom study that you had mentioned earlier, Peter, studied explicitly 2 of those programs. One that was in a state with bringing together students from urban, suburban, and rural schools, and another one that was suburban and urban schools. And those discussions were fascinating, and students really learned a lot from those. And some very, very sharp teachers knew that if they really wanted to expose their students to multiple and competing views, even if they had divergent views in their classrooms, it was very important to try to do that with other students as well. And so I totally agree about her concern that some students are not learning about redlining, but I'm really happy and I applaud whomever organized that program that she participated in. Bravo.
Denora, did I see you looking like you wanted to say something on this one? No. I also thought this was, of course, I don't know, there was a lot she didn't say in her very short question, so I'm jumping to some conclusions, but the point I would want to add is that the deficits in terms of civic knowledge are often with the more advantaged students. They're exactly the ones who don't know about various kinds of problems. So when we think about inequalities in civic knowledge, the assumption shouldn't be that it's the disadvantaged kids who have the lower civic knowledge. On some measures they do, but on other kinds of things, I would guess that the knowledge of redlining is pretty high in Syracuse, New York itself. And I say that as someone who grew up there, and lower in the suburbs. So it turns things around a little. So now we have tons of questions. So here's one about what can we do to support and protect teachers who are fearful of backlash for talking about, for high quality discussion on controversial issues. And the questioner is clear that this extends to both progressive and conservative views that might be, that this questioner thinks that there's backlash on both, from both sides. So what can we do to protect teachers who are allowing controversial issue discussions or even promoting them?
Well, I'll start with one sentence. Make sure administrators know why we need to have such discussions and that they're well prepared to support teachers, and make the case to parents about why this is important.
I think this is also a place where I'll come back to the point around standardization, and to the extent that there were standards for what types of topics should be covered in classrooms, and that was generally applicable, it would reduce the possibility for backlash. So I would just add that to what Diana said there.
Do we think that there are eloquent voices defending the role of controversy in schools? I mean, my perception is that, like Joe said, lots of people are in favor of it in general. But whenever there's a news article about controversy in schools, it's always because of an edge case, an extreme case that at least some people think is very bad. And what you don't see is somebody talking about how important it is, except for geeks like us. So, I mean, do we have a cultural support for the idea that controversy is actually good?
Well, I mean, I think, Peter, some of this ties, I mean, this does tie back to why one of the things Civic Ed can help us with. We have a culture that for decades has taken democracy for granted and has assumed that a lot of democratic values are just widely held and widely understood. And I think Diana's dead on that a piece of this means, you know, in our interviews with principals, many of them feel very flat-footed when asked to defend what's going on in, say, a social studies classroom. And they don't, you know, they're like, well, maybe I should just tell people not to have a conversation, or maybe I should, because that isn't what leaders have been enculturated to be focused on. And people have assumed we're going to be okay. Well, now people have to get a lot clearer. And this has to do with issues of free speech. It has to do with why controversy is reasonable. All of that stuff are things that I think we as a culture, and therefore our educational leaders and our teachers, need to engage with. And ultimately, I do think Civic Ed can help if it's of high quality.
At the end of the last session, or near the end of the last session, a student named Kareem, his first name, asked the two speakers what young people want from, what youth want from civic education. So I'm just wondering what you all think. not what you want from civic education. Too late for you. What do you think the youth want?
I think they want it to be engaging and relevant, right? They want it to be accessible to them. They want to understand what meaning it has when they are sitting in this civics education classroom. What does it have to do with the now and me, right? This notion of self, us, now, how does it all connect and ladder up? And so I think they want it to feel relevant, right? So gone are the days of the boring civics, and I'm going to sit here and memorize all of the founding texts, and that will therefore help me be an informed and engaged citizen. They want to understand everything they're knowing, not just in their civics classroom, in every classroom setting they're sitting in. How is this relevant to making me able to effectively participate in a 21st century society? And so I would go back to saying Action Civics does that, right? It's teaching all of those 21st century skills that prepare young people to enter the world in meaningful and realistic ways.
We do have.
If you read the Rhode Island court opinion, that it's pretty interesting, because the reason these were Rhode Island high school students that sued the state and sued education officials because they thought they were not getting an adequate civic education. And one of the topics they address is this one: what they thought they needed that they weren't getting. And I have to say, it's along the lines that Nora has said. It was, we don't have what we need to be able to vote. We don't know what we need to know to be able to serve on a jury. I mean, they had sort of a list of civic responsibilities that they knew were coming their way and for which they felt ill prepared.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is there's quite a few both examples and also polling evidence that shows that young people do want civics. So it's not actually a hard sell. If you just ask people, young people, do they want civics? They'll say yes. And if you ask it in a fairly rigorous way, but also there are these upsurges of demand for it. The Rhode Island case is one, but students in Lowell, Massachusetts got requirements. So, and interestingly, they'll fight for requirements. It seems how could students be fighting for academic requirement? But I think they think it's important, and it's happened a number of times. So they're not usually the obstacle to change at all. We have
Peter, can I add something to that?
Yes.
One of the things that Paula McAvoy and I found from our research is that students also want classrooms that feel inclusive. They do not want classrooms where they feel like they're being attacked. They do not want classrooms where they think they are being treated in ways that lack civility. So I think one of the reasons why we want teachers to be really well prepared is so they can create that kind of classroom climate. One of the things that was really interesting to me in the research is, and this actually earlier research, when I asked students, kind of, are you afraid of your teacher disagreeing with you? They're like, no. We're not afraid of our teacher. We're afraid of our student peers, unless the classroom is set up in a way where civility is the norm. So I can't help but say that yesterday when I was watching the hearings, I thought, well, that would be the anti-example of civility. And so that's one of the problems we have, is that we would like to be able to point to the world outside of school and say, see, this is what it looks like. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of examples of that.
Our friend Walter Parker, however, posted in the chat a different take on, compatible with what you said, but different, which is that Judge Jackson articulated the pedagogy in a way that was both, persuasive, but also that's what we should expect teachers to be able to do. And obviously they need professional development to be able to do it, but and pre-service education to be able to do it, but that she modeled what it means to explain and defend pedagogy and curriculum under.
And just briefly, what a great opportunity. If you were a well-prepared teacher and you knew you had to have a segment on the Supreme Court in your course, if you could sort of take things out of order and walk into the classroom and say, well, this is obviously the day to be talking about the Supreme Court, and not just what are Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz doing that are not appropriate and Judge Jackson's doing that is appropriate, but why do we have the Senate involved in the decision process? And what might the phrase advise and consent mean? And is that what the Senate is doing? And if that's not what they're doing, maybe how did we get off that track? So it's just a wonderful teaching opportunity, but you'd have to be a more flexible and well-prepared teacher than is probably realistic to expect in most classrooms, I'm afraid.
I'm going to ask, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I don't in our enthusiasm for what's possible, and I think, David, you're getting at that, I don't want us to obscure just how hard it would be in many communities to engage some of these issues. So to show the State of the Union address is now considered a controversial thing to do in many school communities because it's seen as giving the microphone to whomever is president. And so I just think and this does speak to some of what Denora was saying, that we have to re-norm, in a sense, you know, at a more global level, our commitment to being willing to talk about hard stuff, controversial stuff, etc. But that's going to take a kind of political culture that doesn't exist in as vibrant a way as we need it to. Right? So it's going to be real work. I do think that if you mobilize more of the people who aren't on Twitter, right? If you mobilize, you know, as Rick was talking about, fewer of the people at the extremes and more of the actual parents of kids, I think there would be more space for this. But it's tough going.
All right, you know, I think we're actually out of time, and that's fine. We have to be out of time at some point. I'm not going to let you answer this question because you don't have time to, but I will just acknowledge there were a couple of questions about the school as a democratic institution and whether it's possible to teach civics well if the school is not democratic. And actually, I think the answer might be yes, but I think the questioners probably thought so, no. And one of the questioners is the very great educator Deborah Meyer, who asks in the chat whether you can really educate for democracy in a non-democratic school. So that's a question that everybody watching can ponder. But I'll say I don't think the answer is obviously no. I think that it may not be the case. But anyway, my job though is to thank you all for this conversation and then to hand it over to the closing. So I think this has been really rich. I have the feeling that that actually we may have agreed almost too much. I think there are probably some angles on this that you could take apart, but I certainly I think we did reach a lot of consensus, and that's in itself kind of interesting because we do come from different perspectives on this. So we built a model here, and hopefully people found it inspiring and interesting. Certainly, all of your comments were super insightful and based on so much deep thinking of all different kinds, and so. Really appreciate you all and the way that you interacted with each other, and also the organizers of this event. I don't have all the names in front of me, but a whole team that really pulled out a tremendous event, including making everything work on time. And also thanks to the more than 200 people who joined us as participants and who often were putting great comments in chat and thinking hard and calling me out on an assumption earlier and doing a lot of good work. So it has been fun for me. I hope it's been informative for everybody else. I believe this will be posted so that other people can see it and it can be shared. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lila from the organizing team to close us out.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you all for tuning in and for your participation. And thank you to our wonderful panelists and moderators. The Center for Educational Equity will continue to work toward the goal of ensuring that every student is prepared for engaged civic participation. Your support and input is valuable to us, and we would appreciate your participation in the post-conference survey. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our mailing list. The center will soon be publishing a series of articles exploring the rights-based approach to civic readiness, and we'll be excited to hear your response to them. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.